Hi, everyone. If you could take a seat, we're going to get started very soon. Thank you.
View.
Hello. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our public forum for Enhanced Electronic Newsroom Technique, or ENT, best practices. My name is Deborah Patkin. I'm an attorney advisor here with the Disability Rights Office, the Consumer and Governmental Affairs Bureau, CGB, at the Commission. And I will be your moderator for today. We have a wonderful lineup of people today, and we're excited to get started. And to kick off our event, I'd like to welcome Patrick Weber, Chief of the Consumer and Governmental Affairs Bureau. Please welcome Patrick.
Thank you, Deborah. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Commission. Welcome to our event regarding best practices for use of enhanced newsroom technique to make news programming accessible. Everyone here recognizes that televised local news content, whether in the most populous cities or the most rural towns, is vital to all Americans. Regardless of how Americans choose to consume their local news, this critical content informs communities and enhances the lives of its citizens. Television is a tremendous tool for information. For instance, millions watch television to learn about weather concerns, such as the recent catastrophic flooding that caused significant damage and threats to life and property throughout the Midwest. Local news content, if accessible to all, connects us all, including the millions of American viewers with disabilities. And that's why we're here today, to talk about the effectiveness of the implementation of the Commission's enhanced ENT rules to ensure accessibility of local news content in small to mid-sized markets. This is no niche issue. Roughly 55 million TV households are outside of the larger cities where our rules require the gold standard of captioning, which is real-time captions. As recognized by Congress, the goal in captioning video programming is to ensure that all Americans ultimately have access to video services and programs, particularly as video programming becomes an increasingly important part of the home, school, and workplace. In addition, the Commission has noted that closed captioning can be an important tool for children learning to read, both deaf and hard of hearing children and children without hearing disabilities. It can also be important for millions of people learning English as a second language in improving their reading comprehension and spelling skills, and to provide access to video programming in noisy areas such as airports, hotel lobbies, restaurants, and bars. Thanks to the collaboration between consumers in the industry and the work of the Commission, captioning is present in almost all video programming, including live news. This allows millions of Americans to have access that they may not otherwise have. For instance, without captions, many of us would not be able to enjoy the commentary of compelling sporting events, such as March Madness or a major golf tournament during the local evening news. Nor would we be able to obtain important information about a local medical issue, such as a measles outbreak, shared during an interview with an expert on a local morning news program. Further, captioning is a good example of innovation that was intended to enhance access to a specific population, but which has morphed into technology that is of value to all of us. I regularly use closed captioning at home to help me understand dialogue and follow storylines. Today's forum is intended as an educational opportunity to review issues around the use of enhanced ENT to ensure access to live news programming in local markets. We look forward to understanding better the industry's challenges and solutions, consumers' experiences, and met or unmet expectations for accessible local news content, as well as the best practices for stakeholder collaboration to promote accessible news programming. When the Commission affirmed the continued utility of ENT through the enhancements we codified in 2014 and through the application of quality standards for accuracy, placement, synchronicity, and completeness to ENT, caption content, languages in our past orders stated that the Commission would stay engaged to make sure the accessibility ends we sought to achieve were being met by the means we approved. So here we are. Our collective presence at today's forum, and events still to come, is the continuation of that dialogue. The Commission, consumers, and industry are aligned in efforts to ensure that persons who are deaf or hard of hearing have equal access to broadcast local news content to enable and empower their lives. Appropriately, we have a robust agenda. We'll have some show and tell. You'll see how stations are addressing challenges associated with ensuring quality access to oral content across the range of news content production, whether that concerns the manner of production or the nature of the content, and how our rules play out in those settings. And we're going to drill down into best practices for engaging with consumers who are deaf or hard of hearing in your broadcast communities to get their firsthand feedback on whether they're getting access to which they are entitled, and then that the stations clearly want to ensure that they have. We very much appreciate you being with us this afternoon. Thank you again for coming. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Weber, for your wonderful remarks. It's setting the tone for today and our exciting event. Before we go ahead and dive into our discussion about ENT, I wanted to take a quick moment to thank several people. Our Disability Rights Office team for their effort, for taking lead for various things today. Susie Rosen-Singleton, Elliot Greenwald, Theodore Marcus, Rosaline Crawford, April Jackson, and Robert McConnell, who is currently monitoring our laptop. I would also like to thank the interpreting team and our CART services for providing accessibility for today's event, as well as our wonderful CMR team for doing all the hard work for setting up for today. So just to give an overview of what the afternoon looks like, we will have two presentations. One that will provide an overview of our requirements for enhanced ENT, and the other will be a status of the implementation of our rules. And after that, we will have two panels that will be focused on industry challenges, and then we will have a break. And the second panel will be focused on stakeholder collaboration in implementing ENT best practices. I encourage those of you here and who are watching online to engage with us with questions. If you are here in the room, there is a microphone here on a stand. You can feel free to line up for asking questions to each panel. For those of you who are watching at home online, you are welcome to email your questions to livequestions@fcc.gov. And we have Robert monitoring that, and he will print them out and give them to us as we go on. So next up, we have our presentations. Our first, Susie Rosen-Singleton, Chief of the Disability Rights Office under CGB, who will be providing an overview of the requirements for enhanced ENT. Following Susie, we have Theodore Marcus, Deputy Chief in the Disability Rights Office in CGB. He will be providing a status of the current implementation process of our enhanced ENT requirements. Welcome and thank you both.
Can we get the PowerPoint up, please? Great. Thank you so much. I wanted to make sure that would come up for us and everything's working. Hello and welcome everyone. It's really exciting to be here with you this afternoon. As you heard from Patrick, captioning is beneficial for all of us. I just read a study recently about how 80% of people who use captioning are not people with disabilities, which is very interesting to see how captioning really has become ubiquitous and has a huge benefit for the general population. So it's not only for people who depend on captioning that we have rules on captioning. And now we'll get started with our slides. First, we're going to explain the 4 requirements for quality standards for closed captioning, and I want to caution you that this PowerPoint is very wordy. And the reason for that is because this is going to be archived on the web, so that you and those of you who are watching online, anyone in any local stations, could rely on this as a resource for some basic information about our requirements for enhanced ENT. The web page itself is also going to be shared at the end of my presentation, and there's some more information there with copies of the slides that will be on the website. So for the captioning requirements for quality, we issued an order in 2014 establishing these 4 requirements. The first is that the captions that you see must be accurate. The captions must reflect the dialogue and other sounds and music that are in the audio track to the fullest extent possible, based on the type of program, and must identify the speaker. In other words, no censoring of content. Captions need to be verbatim. Secondly, synchronicity. Captions must be synchronous with the dialogue that is being spoken to the fullest extent possible, depending again on the type of programming that is being shown. They must appear at a speed that is readable by the viewer. Third, it must also be complete. Captioning must run from the beginning to the end of any given program, to the extent possible, based again on the type of captioning. So if you are watching a program that it moves to commercial, the captioning should not be cut off prematurely. The captioning should end before the commercial begins, or another program begins, so that the captioning is considered complete. And the fourth of these tenets is captioning placement. They must be placed appropriately on the screen and not cover up other important visual information on the screen, like character faces, any featured text, or other textual information, and otherwise impede access to the program content. So that information also should not cover up the captioning. Emergency alerts, for example, we should not overlap captioning. Those placement must be arranged in such a way which is really critical to ensure readability for all of those things. As you saw, the previous slide talked a lot about types of programming based on types of programming, and we recognize that there are different types of programming that have different captioning quality capabilities. For example, pre-recorded programming, when you have the luxury of time to revise for errors, typos, and so forth, and the expectation is that that should be 100% in compliance in general. Second, live programming, which is typically what we see with live news. The FCC will consider the challenges, for example, lack of opportunity to review the captions, but will also expect captioning to be sufficiently accurate, synchronous, complete, and appropriately placed to allow a viewer who depends on captioning to understand the program and have a viewing experience that is comparable to that of someone listening to the soundtrack. And the third category of programming is near live programming. This is programming that is performed and recorded within 24 hours prior to when it is first shown on television. And such programming will be evaluated under the same standards applied for live programming, although we do encourage measures that can be taken prior to the program's airing to improve its captioning quality, such as the delivery of materials in advance to the captioner to help them prepare to the extent possible. And the quality standards do apply in those ways to these three different types of programming. Now, brings us specifically to local news, what we are all here for today. In 1998, we outlined what should be expected for access to local news programming. 1998, about 21 years ago now, and we recognized that real-time captioning, which is to convert into captioning all of the audio information in real time to captioning. This is what we mean by real-time captioning, is a best practice, but we also recognize as well the challenges of providing real-time captioning for all stations. And again, this is in the year 1998. We documented in our order in 1998 that real-time captioning is required on major news networks, the major national broadcast networks, such as ABC, CBS, Fox, and NBC. Also, affiliates of these networks, which are in the top 25 television markets as defined in Nielsen's designated market areas. And those are typically updated on an annual basis, but those top 25 are what's included. And then the national non-broadcast networks that serve at least 50% of all homes subscribing to multi-channel video programming services. And so anything that falls into any of these three categories must be captioned in real time. And so those local news programs are required to be captioned by a live captioner. Outside of these categories, all other local newscasts may use electronic newsroom technique, or ENT. And this is a teleprompter-based method for providing access to captioning, essentially scripted for the anchor, and often does lack captioning for things like live segments, sports, weather, and late-breaking news. I'll add one more thing about our 1998 order as well. In that order, we also had language that while we recognized that at the time real-time captioning was not feasible for most television stations, that we recognized that technology would evolve over time and that reliance on real-time captioning would increase while reliance on ENT would fade out. This was, again, what was predicted in 1998. And then we moved to June of 2014 when we implemented and adopted our enhanced ENT rules to recognize that we need to improve access to local news. There are three requirements. First, covered stations must provide scripts for the following programming: in-studio produced news, sports, weather, and entertainment programming. Secondly, weather interstitials, in which there is not a requirement to precisely track the words that are being spoken on air. And third, pre-produced programming to the extent technically feasible. Secondly, for live interviews or live on the scene or breaking news segments, which are not scripted, covered stations must supplement them with crawls, textual information, and other means to the extent technically feasible. The third requirement for these enhanced rules that coverage stations will provide training to all news staff on scripting for improving ENT and appoint an ENT coordinator who will be accountable for compliance. Now we move to today, 2019. We have looked back at what has been done up to this point. In 2015, the FCC was required to review the effectiveness of the enhanced ENT implementation. That's 1 year after the effective date of the new enhanced ENT rules, 2014. That was June of 2014, so in 2015, we did evaluate the effectiveness of those rules, and then we also had a requirement that the industry must file a progress report to the Commission in order to identify what challenges exist in implementing the enhanced ENT rules, if there are success stories, what concerns stations may have, and so forth. This was again in 2015 that it was filed, and consumer groups did also file a reply to discuss their view of that progress report as well. Both of those copies are in our docket. If you want to go to the electronic comment filing system, or ECFS, that's at www.fcc.gov/ECFS. You can type in there CG docket number 05-231. You can there find both copies of the report and the reply. In 2016, the industry and consumer groups got together and actually met to talk about what the next steps would be. And just to summarize those filings, I'll say that they are on the docket as well for anyone who would like to look at them, but just to summarize them, the groups agreed that additional best practices were needed. And I just outlined what the Commission required and the best practices as well. Now the stakeholders had actually said that they wanted to add further to that for a number of reasons. First, they recognizes that they needed more accurate scripting of weather interstitials. Secondly, they needed to have a better understanding on a local level about the obligations for emergency information that's being delivered through the local news. Third, recognizing the importance of consistent training on a local level about how to make live news programming accessible. And another suggestion from those filings was that they need to have an educational campaign so that the community, both the stations and the consumers, are able to understand what the requirements are and how to implement them well. And the next steps from that were continued stakeholder collaboration. And that's an opportunity that we have today to continue to evaluate the effectiveness of enhanced ENT and the accessibility level of local news. For those of you who aren't able to read the slide, I'm going to quickly just state what is on this slide. Resources, you can visit the Disability Rights Office webpage. That's www.fcc.gov/accessibility. We also have an events page. It's quite a mouthful. It's https://www.fcc.gov/news-events/forum-local-news-programs. Contact information, you can contact DRO in a number of different ways. Our email address is dro@fcc.gov. You can also contact us by voice at 202-418-2517. You can contact us via video phone at 844-432-2275. And finally, by TTY at 888-835-5322. In addition to that, we also have an online complaint form. That is really the best way to let us know if you have any concerns. That's at fcc.gov/complaints. And you are also welcome to subscribe to our listserv that we use to distribute information to our subscribers about disability-related activities and rulemaking proceedings. And you can send an email to subscribe to accessinfo@fcc.gov. Thank you so much for making a difference today. I look forward to being with you for the rest of the afternoon. Again, this PowerPoint will be archived on the web. You can contact us if you need any help finding any of these resources. And with that, I will welcome Theo Marcus to come up and join me here and share with you the state of affairs around access to local news. Thank you, Theo.
Thank you, Susie. Thank you, everybody. I so appreciate
So 1 second, if we can take down the PowerPoint, if you would. Thank you.
I like the PowerPoint. Thanks. I'm happy to be here and meet with you today about this important topic. Again, I'm Theodore Marcus. I'm Deputy Chief, or one of the Deputy Chiefs of the Disability Rights Office. And what I do, among other things, is I oversee complaints and requests for dispute assistance. When consumers have accessibility problems and our rules cover them or seem to cover them, they'll come to us, and we will take the information and we will work on it, either by way of dealing with complaints or, as the case may be, helping them deal directly with the industry to resolve disputes. We have a couple of clips that we'd like to show today to kind of level set with everybody. These clips are a reasonably recent vintage, and they're verified examples of covered station utilization of enhanced ENT for news broadcasts. I'd like to set the table a little bit about these before we get into them. First is a clip of a local news segment about a violent multiple crime event in or around the Greenville, Spartanburg, Asheville, South Carolina, and North Carolina digital marketing area. It's designated number 38 in the list of Nielsen's DMAs. We apologize up front for any discomfort that anybody might experience with respect to the subject matter of the content. The other clip involves a local sports story from Austin, Texas, involving the University of Texas. This is DMA number 40. Now, you're going to observe that the material that we're presenting in each of these clips is what I'll call fluid, which is to say it moves between and among in-studio desk, on-scene live reporting, interview portions, cutbacks to anchors, and those kinds of things. And that all presents a mix of compliance scenarios associated with our captioning rules. And you got to have a certain dexterity to be able to meet the obligations and requirements of our rules while making these presentations and to have a fluid presentation of content. Secondly, just a couple more observations. We want to say that these clips are not being presented as sort of the state of the record of captioning compliance, whether with respect to the overall pool of covered entities or with respect to what's happening in the given regions at issue here, or even with respect to the stations involved or their affiliated entities. We're not expressing an opinion on that. And so finally, further want to say that although these stations are not in the top 25 DMAs, of course, they're not that far removed that one should attempt to extrapolate from what you're seeing here as being indicative of what I see down market in complaints. The bag, if you will, is decidedly mixed. And it underscores the timeliness and the significance of what we're doing today. With that, I'd like to cue up the first video, if we have it. And I don't know which direction to look, but it looks like we have it there.
Here on Fox Carolina, the coroner releasing the results of an autopsy after 3 people, including an 8-year-old girl, were all gunned down inside a Greenwood County home on Friday. And tonight we can confirm this was a double murder-suicide. The sheriff's office says Michael Frazier and his girlfriend Natasha Dawn McDonald were found inside that home. They say Frazier shot and killed McDonald before turning the gun on his daughter, 8-year-old Heaven Frazier, before taking his own life. We learned the little girl's name again, Heaven Frazier, just getting this picture of her tonight. And now the sheriff's office, along with the community activist group, have put together a memorial in Heaven's honor outside the sheriff's office.
And that's where we find Fox Carolina's Madison Stiles tonight. Madison?
Yeah, well, they've since moved that memorial inside for the night, but lots of people from the community came out here today, including several classmates of Heaven, all coming out here to drop off a toy at her memorial in honor of Heaven. And her family, including her mom, were also out here earlier today as well, emotional. Her mom covered her face, unable to speak. But her grandmother told us Heaven was such a bright light in all of their lives, always willing to help and take care of others. And as they shared stories of her, toys began collecting on her memorial, some even personalized with her name written on them.
All the grandchild I had is gone to heaven, but I'm glad she's in a better place. Since I had to lose in such a young life, we're in a better place she could be right now.
It's about love and people pulling together and not pulling apart, because heaven is going on to heaven to be with God, and she's his precious angel.
And several from the community brought flowers, stuffed animals, and balloons to the memorial, remembering the good times with Heaven. Some from her classroom, and others from their neighborhood. Founder of Put Down the Guns Now Young People, Jack Logan, stood by the family's side through all of this today, even hugging them, saying together they'll get through this. And the family thanked the community for all of their support. And that memorial will be back out again tomorrow morning through Wednesday afternoon. If you'd like to come out here and drop off balloons or flowers or a toy, the sheriff's office does say that all the toys collected at the memorial will be given to families less fortunate this Christmas. We're live in Greenwood County. Madison Stiles, Fox Carolina News Tonight.
Okay, can we stop? Can we stop? Good. You'll notice that there are 2 sets of captions running on this, and I didn't set the table properly for that. I believe at the top are our imposed captions here at the FCC, the point of which is that this meeting has to be accessible. The bottom portion is what appeared on the date and time in question with respect to the broadcast. So I apologize for any confusion. Do not construe the top portion as being indicative of whether they complied with placement obligations or the like. That's just to make sure that everybody knows what's being said accurately. Okay, please run the second one. Thank you.
That was 1995. Texas celebrating a trip to the Sugar Bowl by winning a conference championship. And the same thing could happen on Saturday, win or lose. You see, the way the Big 12 is set up, most years the Big 12 champion goes to New Orleans to the Sugar Bowl. That's what happens if Texas beats Oklahoma on Saturday. They're going to go to the Sugar Bowl. But if Oklahoma wins, if Texas loses, Texas will either go to the Sugar Bowl or the Alamo Bowl, maybe somewhere else. That's a little bit dicey, but it's a very tricky situation to determine if it's the Alamo Bowl or the Sugar Bowl. Check this out. It all depends on the college football playoff rankings. Right now, the top 4 are going to go, of course, to the playoffs, and Oklahoma is number 5. But remember, Alabama and Georgia, 1 and 4, play each other in the SEC championship game. Somebody has to lose. If Oklahoma wins big over Texas, they jump into the top 4. But what if Texas plays a great game? What if it's a...
Great, thanks. As a University of Texas law school graduate, I'm sure you all enjoyed that particular content. We're now going to set the table for the 1:45 panel. That'll be led by Elliot. We're a little bit ahead of schedule, which is never a bad thing. Thank you very much, and I will come back a little bit later and close at the end of these proceedings. Thank you.
Okay, well, welcome everybody. I'm Elliot Greenwald, Deputy Chief of the Disability Rights Office, and want to thank everybody for coming out on a Friday afternoon, or for those listening on the streaming, for listening to the streaming on a Friday afternoon. I'm going to first, this is the panel on enhanced ENT implementation, industry challenges, and solutions. I'm going to introduce each of the panelists one at a time, and when I call your name and give your title, I'd like you to introduce yourself and your organization and provide an overview of your work with respect to live programming and the use of enhanced electronic newsroom technique practices. So the first person is Lance Croft, who's News Operations Manager, WBRC-TV, Birmingham, Alabama.
Thanks very much. So I'm the News Operations Manager for the Fox affiliate in Birmingham, Alabama. We're Market 45. Amongst some of my responsibilities is the ENT coordination for the station and overall training and compliance, training and making sure that we comply with the ENT guidelines.
Okay, thank you, Lance. Next is Brett Jenkins, who's Executive Vice President, Chief Technology Officer, Nexstar Media Group.
Thank you, Elliot. It's great to be here today. Again, I'm the CTO of Nexstar Media Group. We are a diversified media company that leverages localism to bring services, television, in this context, to our consumers and advertisers. We run traditional media, television. We have digital products as well. We own, operate, program, or provide sales and other services to 174 television stations and related digital multicast signals reaching about 100 markets across the U.S. We cover approximately 39% of all U.S. television households with some kind of television signal. And our portfolio includes primary affiliations of NBC, CBS, ABC, Fox, CW, and My Network Television. As the CTO of Nexstar, I oversee our technology strategy across both our television and digital businesses. I'm essentially responsible for all new technology that is implemented across those businesses, and part of my job is to make sure that our company is leveraging technology appropriately within our products and operations. So when thinking about that job in context of this forum, how I'm involved in enhanced ENT, I sort of have a top-level perch across a lot of television stations, looking broadly at how we can best implement process and technology to provide the best possible service in the most effective and efficient ways to satisfy our viewers.
Okay, thank you, Brett. Next is Christian Vogler, Director of the Technology Access Program at Gallaudet University.
Hi, everyone. Thank you. Here I have two hats. The first requires a little background. I'm from the Technology Access Program, which focuses on researching in accessible technology for people who are deaf and hard of hearing. We look at mainstream products, we evaluate, research, and develop new prototype technologies. We have a strong partnership with the consumer advocacy groups, for example, TDI, HLAA, and NAD, and a strong partnership with a variety of industries and companies. Of course, we also do inform policymaking decisions. So on the one hand, I bring an engineering perspective on some of the technical challenges that exist with regards to providing access to captioning. And on the other hand, my second hat, we have a specific research project that has to do with captioning quality metrics. which is new and just started in October of 2018. It is a 5-year research grant funded under the National Institute on Disability and Independent Living and Rehabilitation Research under HHS. And it is my goal for that grant to investigate to great detail how people with hearing loss perceive and understand closed captioning, and how they perceive and understand the programming, and how that relates to coming up with some potential objective closed captioning quality metrics. Basically, the project goal is to determine how do you measure those 4 of the FCC's captioning quality categories: synchronicity, accuracy, completeness, and placement. And that wraps it up. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Christian. And next is Kelly Williams, Senior Director of Engineering and Technology Policy at the National Association of Broadcasters.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. I'm an old hat at accessibility at the FCC. I suppose I've been involved in accessibility policy, 20 years. I guess I kind of predate a lot of some of the legislation, but on the legislative side, my background is in television operations and engineering. I've been at NAB now going on 30 years. I guess most applicable manner, I was one of the team on the industry side that helped work out the enhanced ENT rules, and I think we all spent a lot of time talking about what was an appropriate balance for the rules, and I think we did a good job. So I'm happy to be here. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you, Kelly. This is Elliot. I have several prepared questions to ask each of the panelists, and then we will move from there to audience participation. And the sequence will be that the way it'll be answers is first Lance, and then Brett, then Kelly, and then Christian for each of the questions. So the first question is, discuss technical challenges you've observed in providing ENT-generated captions for scripted content and non-scripted content, and how you have resolved such difficulties. Please include in your discussion the different challenges you have encountered with respect to the following: in-studio produced news, sports, weather, and entertainment programming, weather interstitials, pre-produced programming, live interviews, live on the scene, or breaking news segments. So go ahead, Lance.
Okay. Well, I can bring a little perspective from the operations of the newsroom. In looking at the enhanced ENT, the improvements that we've made have a lot to do with soundbite verbatim, having the reporters include things like tosses to live shots, wrapping up from live shots, things that normally wouldn't have been, say, 5 years ago, added. And I think we've come a long way with, obviously, the anchors have to have the teleprompt script to be able to do their job. But in addition to that, looking at ways that we can complete all the scripts to make sure that we're providing good service. With news, it's pretty standard. You've got the reporters who may or may not be live. Gone are the days of ad-lib tosses to reporters. These are all scripted, and it makes it for a better, more clear closed captioning product. Weather, sports, also a complete script is now included through the teleprompter, which in turn feeds the closed captioning encoder. Specifically with weather, I find that in this day of social media and digital products, our weather teams are producing more and more material that for over the course of the day. And this is the material that we use for the weather segments, the weather interstitials. Instead of doing what probably years ago would be taking some National Weather Service wire copy that didn't really match the specific content on our broadcast, we're now using specifics that more or less stay with the line of conversation that a meteorologist is doing live. And that would be very difficult if you were asking the meteorologist to do this for every newscast, for every weather segment. But because of digital properties and social media, they are constantly updating their material and the content throughout the day parts of the television day. So the material that's moving through for closed captioning more closely matches the conversation that's happening for over the traditional audio. With pre-produced programming, we, in say a sports special or an education special that we might produce, we would utilize live captioners, and we would, for all intents and purposes, run the show and record it with live captioners to capture that captioning. Therefore, when it ran at a different time, it would have correct captioning. We also are very careful on certain programs that if it's going to be difficult, if it's going to be a lot of, let's say, election coverage, or something that would be that would have a lot of conversation back and forth between anchors and guests, we might opt to use live captioning for those programs. Live captioning comes with an expense, but the product is superior away from the traditional newscast, and that happens a good bit. Lastly, regarding live interviews, breaking news segments, that's a challenge. We rely heavily on use of the lower third graphics during a breaking news event. Sort of similar to what you would see on CNN or Fox News or one of the cable news networks, where you see the lower third graphic changing with the content. So instead of just saying apartment fire downtown, you would, as information comes across, the producer in the booth would actually update the CG to better describe what's happening. Now, it's not verbatim, but it does a better job of getting the point across to someone who doesn't have the sound available to them. And I would also add that breaking news events often go for a long time. So by the time somebody gets a chance to type up something that can be added to the script, either from the television producer or from a digital product that's going out, because with the digital products we are pushing material instantly, and so that material can then be integrated into the television script for a late breaking spot news type event. So those are challenges, but I think we've come a long way since 2014. We continue to improve our product, and we'll talk a little bit later about monitoring the product and some techniques that we use to make sure that we're in compliance.
Okay, go ahead, Brett.
So I joked before the panel that I was just going to say what he said and then pass the baton. I'll try to add things of value and not just reiterate, because in fact, most broadcasters operate almost identically. We've all either learned through the School of Hard Knocks, or there's been enough sharing and migration of news people across the industry that the techniques are remarkably similar, I think, across the various television stations. The thing to remember, if you're for those in the audience or those who are watching who don't know how a television station works, I think it's helpful to have a little bit of background to understand that the way a newscast is put together, we use something called a rundown, which essentially is the sort of story lists and that we're going to go through in a newscast. And it is, for most newscasts, it is really a highly scripted, prepared event. And that affords us the opportunity to do the things that Lance was describing, where really a good portion of the newscast is scripted. And so scripts are simply attached to this rundown, and each segment has that script attached. When you have areas in the news that maybe before enhanced ENT was in practice used to be more ad-libbed, the reality is that those sections just simply aren't as ad-libbed as they used to be, because we now require the meteorologists and the sportscasters to do more scripting of their segments in advance. And so those scripts get attached to a rundown, and as the show is being produced, there's something you're probably familiar with, a teleprompter. That teleprompter is then running with the script. If you're an anchor or a reporter, you might be reading directly from the teleprompter, but even if you're a meteorologist or a sportscaster, you still have the teleprompter now in front of you. And so that has sort of forced the ad-libbing to match a little bit of the script. And I think that's a lot of what we've seen, an impact of enhanced ENT on our newscasts. So we require all our television stations to follow those procedures. We basically say if it's going into the news show, it's going to be scripted. And that goes for weather interstitials, any sports sections, those types of things. Probably the one area, as Lance said, that I would agree that we still struggle with is where there is breaking news that is happening immediately before a scheduled newscast, and the story is breaking so quickly that we just haven't had time to write a script, and yet we want to include it in the newscast. And we use, as Lance described, similar techniques to try to use lower third graphics or get as much information as we can. And oftentimes there'll be script writing in the background, so if the story kind of comes back up later in the rundown, by that point we'll have information about that breaking news story. Live shots, we saw an example in the first clip, I think, earlier, in the earlier segment of live shot. We call those live shots, right, where you're tossing to a reporter in the field. Again, those are handled very similarly to what I described. Field reporters are required to script out their story in advance, and that is then attached to the rundown. And while there'll be some ad-libbing, for the most part we find, and over time it's really become a practice where those live reporters are sticking more and more to the scripts that they've prepared in advance. For most breaking news, so I talked to you about the one challenge I think operationally we still have, which is a breaking news story that happens, that breaks just before a scheduled newscast. For much breaking news, many breaking news events, so emergency weather or some kind of emergency event, maybe an Amber Alert, where we really have to get on the air and get a story out, quite frankly, we simply pick up the phone and go to live captioning. There's no other way to do it, and that's what we instruct our stations to do. So most emergency type events, you really don't have a choice, I think, except to provide live captioning. Similarly, for most of our pre-produced programming, so the programming that is produced and aired within that 24-hour cycle, almost always we have to use live captioning because we haven't found a better technique than calling up, and when we're doing what's called live to tape, where the show is essentially live, it's going taped and then it's played back, maybe 6 hours later within the broadcast day, we will typically instruct our stations to use live captioning. So we essentially, I think the summary of what I'm trying to say is we used enhanced ENT where we think it works well, where we can match the prepared scripts with what's being broadcast, and we still rely on live captioning a good portion of the time where the content requires you to be in live captioning.
Okay. Thank you, Brett. Kelly?
So it's interesting, I think, listening to my two colleagues talk, I think one of the biggest challenges is human behavior, getting news staff, news operations to alter their workflow. And even with training, you see things like that sports segment, the UT sports segment, where in this particular case, that reporter is no longer with that station. But what that reporter did, he didn't script. It appears that he wrote an outline, which appeared on the teleprompter, and that's what you see on the captions, which didn't sort of match up with what he was saying. So I think even though that particular station has worked really hard, it's getting a particular reporter to follow the rules and then take action. I think for the most part, what I've seen across the industry is a real significant change in the workflow and how news has happened and how the workflow of news is produced, particularly with respect, everybody notices that Brett's using a tablet. So many field reporters use tablets now rather than handwritten paper. So that helps from a technology standpoint. Now I've got that script in electronic form, and that can be sent and integrated pretty quickly into the, I don't want to call it a particular product, but your news workflow product. So I think a lot of those hurdles have been overcome. I think behavior is still a bit of an issue, and I think a lot of the things that we've seen where there are problems still, and again, it tends to be, did that particular reporter or talent or writer sort of script up fully? I think the other part is, and you saw it a little bit with the live shot, the shooting, where someone writes a script, but even as a human, you don't read that script or say that. You think about it in your own life. So a couple of things I noticed where there's, at the end of that segment, there was, what was written and on the captions was heaven's event. And talent said the event for heaven. Is that an error or not an error? That kind of gets to Christians, how do people perceive what errors are? So that reporter didn't say exactly what they had written, but I think I think all in all, it did a pretty good job of conveying the basic information that's there. So I think definitely there's probably some more work to be done, but I think we've done a pretty good job. Okay. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Kelly. And Christian?
This is Christian speaking. Thank you. So I've got two main points that I'd like to say kind of in response. The first one is about judging if captioning is rendering an error or not. And second, about how you measure kind of the variety of models that are out there. I think that we are understanding a little bit better how humans perceive these things, but I do want to point out that some of the past work from the BBC looked at the difference between a person looking at captioning only with no sound versus people who are listening to the sound and watching the captioning simultaneously. And they found that those two groups perceive the captioning in totally different ways. The first group, without sound, is much more tolerant of captioning delay and the occasional word error. But those who are relying on both the auditory content and the captioning content are very sensitive both to delay and to these minor word errors. For example, when you talk about reducing ad-libbing, that certainly does help the group of those who are both listening and watching simultaneously. But it can be very distracting if the captioning and the audio information don't agree. I experienced that as well now that I'm starting to use some of my residual hearing, and it's somewhat off-putting because I feel I must have missed something, and what did I miss? And then all of a sudden I'm frustrated, and then my mental processing and my obligation as a viewer goes up. So then the question is whether the content is being conveyed well. That is a separate issue even if the words don't match. Is the content being conveyed well? One of the positive aspects of ENT is that it typically does have a better latency, right? The time between when a word is spoken and when the word shows up in the captioning is typically better, but you have to look carefully about the words matching what is actually being said. So I would encourage you to look into that area to see if there is some way to improve that aspect of provisioning ENT. And I guess I'll add one more thing in that same vein. Some of my past investigatory collaborations have looked at captioning and how to correct captioning on the fly. And there are some ideas from that may have some relevance to ENT as well. And I guess my second point, when we're talking about live events, they appear in the news very frequently, and we're seeing these bottom third summaries of some of these live news events. I do want to say, having grown up in Germany, Germany had no requirement for closed captioning at all in my youth. So I spent the majority of my life understanding nothing about the news. But Germany does have some of these crawls that summarize the news information. But I found that that does not even approach being the same as getting access to the content. It both misses information, but it also really is what makes watching fun. It's not just the content, but how the content is being conveyed by that given program. And the captioning is the only thing that's going to really give you that. A summary of the information is just going to lose some of that ephemeral experience of watching news.
Okay, thank you, Christian. The next question, which was alluded to before by, I can't remember whether it was Lance or Brett made I think it was Lance who alluded to it, is what procedures or policies are suggested to monitor compliance with the FCC's enhanced ENT rules? In particular, what solutions have you found to be helpful to ensure that viewers have access to the content offered during live news programming, including, in the same categories as before, in-studio produced news, sports, weather and entertainment programming, weather interstitials, pre-produced programming, and live interviews, live on the scene, or breaking news segments?
Well, I think it's a cultural change within the newsroom. It's harder now to fill this order, and it can't, let's break it down to the reporter. The reporter has got to spend a little more time sending their scripts in, taking the soundbite verbatim, writing a tease for the anchors to toss to them in the live shot scenario. So it takes more time for the folks that are actually doing the writing, the reporters, the producers, your weather talent. But it also takes more time on the line producer, to make sure that everything is scripted in a way that makes sense to someone utilizing closed captioning. Identifying the speaker, trying to somehow describe a nat sound break. This is a little bit more, a little more work on everyone's part, and I think that as far as to monitor the compliance, it's a shared responsibility throughout the entire newsroom staff. The line producer needs to make sure that when they go upstairs to booth their show, to put it on television, that complete scripting is just as important as attached video or microphones being put on lapels. It has to happen. At our shop, we still have a teleprompter operator. Some places the anchor actually, through a foot pedal or a small device in their hand, operates their own teleprompter. At our station, we have someone who actually runs the prompter and adjusts the rate for the read rate of that reporter or anchor person. It's their job, in addition to, sometimes it's kind of funny, this is usually an entry-level production assistant job. Maybe this person was an intern who has now taken on a part-time position. Teleprompting is not difficult, but it's the most important job because the newscast stops without the teleprompter. In regards to what we're talking about here, the teleprompter is feeding the closed caption encoder. So it's their job to make sure that not only are you prompting for the talent, but when you toss to the package, that is, play out a pre-produced news story, that you continue to prompt as if it was being presented live. So the content is in line with the pictures that folks are seeing. The soundbite goes along. So in other words, not just zipping through the script to set up for the next studio live portion, but to actually make sure that you're running it correctly. Being able to ask this employee to not only make sure that they're teleprompting these taped segments correctly, I also utilize them for policing the scripts to make sure that they are complete. If something happens to be missing, if a reporter didn't put a toss to their live shot, didn't script it for us, this teleprompter operator allows me to have somebody that can report to me and say, Lance, so-and-so didn't have this material in their package today, and then I can address that. So that's another sort of line of defense. I would also say that as shared responsibility within the newsroom, the news managers all share in responsibility for quality control checks on the newscast. Now, this would be things like quality of video, quality of audio, different studio production issues, but complete closed captioning also falls into that category and is its own category. So, the managers have a tendency to have closed captioning up on their monitors in the office to make sure, number one, there is captioning and that it makes sense. Now, that's not something that, your teleprompter operator is your first line, but then as the news managers are watching these newscasts for quality control, making sure that complete closed captioning is a portion of that. I guess in addition to working, let's talk about weather for a second, because those are relatively large portions of newscasts that are talent-driven. There's a lot of content, graphic content on the screen, but the news, the weather presenter is kind of telling the story in their own words. So how do you deal with a 3-minute newscast or weathercast that's basically being read off the cuff? I think it all boils down to the fact that through blogs and apps and weather stories on the digital platform, we're able to provide a complete conversational script for the closed captioning product. This is another point where I asked the teleprompter operator to stretch the material. Every day the weather professional is emailing closed captioning content to the producers to be added into the rundown as a script. And we have a 30-second weather, we have a 1-minute weather, we might have a 3.5-minute full weather forecast. And each of these are written out specifically for those products. So if you're dealing with a 3-minute weathercast, you're going to have probably at least 3 minutes worth of content that's conversational content. And stretching the teleprompter operating throughout that ends up with a better product for closed captioning. I would say, to speak in with the live interviews, breaking news, on the scene material, again, it's a shared responsibility of the newsroom. If you've got a digital producer downstairs who is, let's take for instance, we're on the scene of an apartment fire, and the fire department issues a news release about that as we're showing that. That news release can be used as scripted information until we have a more complete news story put together. That's good information that's going to be added to our digital products on the web or on the app, mobile app. But it's shared. It's not just the producer's job in the booth who's responsible for that particular show. It's not just the reporter's job who is on the scene trying to gather information and most likely operate the camera these days. It's the job of others in the newsroom to fall in and to help fortify and support the content that's on the air at that time. So I think it really boils down to a newsroom philosophy when it comes to that. And I'll finish with saying that frequency of reminder and feedback to the staff when you notice something that's not complete, or from time to time just going and reminding the news staff of the portions of the newsroom of the ENT and what exactly we're trying to accomplish with it. I think it goes a long way to keep that on the front burner and to remind folks these are the marks we're trying to hit, and this is where we're trying to get with our product. So just frequency of reminding and continued training. Certainly onboarding with new employees that may come in from another television station or another market that maybe wasn't as aggressive with their concerns for compliance. I know that our company, Gray Television, is our parent company, and there's an expectation and there's ongoing training to provide to folks as they come on to make sure that they're aware of what our goals are and what our compliance concerns are.
Okay, thank you, Lance. Brett? Yeah, so Kelly made an interesting point in response to the last question, which Lance has been talking about, which is the issues that we have both in implementation and as pertains to monitoring. These are probably viewed best as not technology problems. They're human capital management problems, right? So in some sense, as a CTO of an organization, I can step away from the panel now and say this is it's really up to the people, I think, to make sure that the procedures are followed. And we would, frankly, I would love to have technology solutions that
could enable us to be better. We're constantly looking at those things. I know that's a lot of what Christian does in his job, is how do we move the technology forward to be able to get better and better at this. The way, so frankly, the state of where we are today in terms of monitoring and ensuring compliance, that is not a technology solution that we've employed. It's a people solution. And the way at Nexstar our stations manage that is we run audits, essentially. So we do all the things during the production and before the production to try to make sure we get it right. And we go through training, and we have producers and even news directors checking scripts and approving them and making sure, and stories don't run if they don't have a script loaded into the rundown. But on the back end, we still have a compliance or a monitoring obligation, we feel, to quality check our products. And so for us, it's very simple. We have people assigned at the station who, during the broadcast day, select at random one or two shows, and they literally go down and sit back and play them back with the captioning. And that is, I have the form on my tablet right here. They are checking for accuracy, placement, synchronicity, and completeness. And it's just a check mark on the form. They fill out a log every day. That log is, if there's anything that person sees that they don't like, they log it. The log goes to the news director's desk, who's the top, sort of the buck stops here person at the station in terms of the news product. And if there are issues, we take corrective action. And again, as I've stated before, usually that corrective action is in the form of sitting with the people who were responsible maybe for not providing the level of quality that we expect, and training them and reinforcing what their obligations are. So that's essentially how we do it. It really, I can tell you by experience, sometimes there are technical problems with a malfunctioning, box in the newsroom, but in most cases where we do, where we feel like we're falling short of the mark, it really does come down to training, reinforcement, and just a relentless focus on quality of the product. And we try our best to deliver that.
Okay. Thank you, Brett. Kelly?
So if it's okay, but even if it's not, if I could just circle back, just talk a little bit about, and I guess it's still in the context of monitoring, synchronicity. Interestingly, I don't know if any of you noticed that in the clip we saw, some of the captioning was actually ahead of the talent speaking. And that it's an interesting thing with so the synchronicity part kind of goes both ways. And I think, as Brett pointed out, ENT is somewhat technically a much more simple, it's simpler from a technology perspective because the captions originate in the newsroom workflow software. They go right directly to a encoder and then out the door into the video and out the door. And so you really don't find that. So while this next statement is a bit out of the scope of this, there is technology that checks for the presence of captions, and we all know that. That's more global. That's not ENT specific. But that's not really what we're getting at here. And I think that thinking about ways, with Christian's research, about how one could correct something that happened in the past. Now, those of you who have been around me for years understand that by the time you see a caption, it was created in time back here. So it'd be cool to figure out how you fix it in time out there. So I look forward to that research. But I think it's something that's important. Online in a digital product, yeah, there's perhaps a way to do that. But I think pretty much for our members, a little bit in terms of NAB, we disseminate, we have the best practices out. We send those to our members. We bring it up in certain forums when we have them, when they're appropriate. But also I would say that my experience is, well, we have representatives of 2 groups here. For most of the groups, they do quite a bit of training and they do news. You know, a lot of these groups, even though we're in small markets, and we pointed out that before, they do a lot of news. They do 40, 50, 60 hours of news a week. And they're very conscientious. You know, we want to reach all of our members, all of our viewers, and they work very hard at that. And I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Kelly. Christian?
Sure, this is Christian speaking. Thank you. Wow. So I think I'll start out with the point about training. From a research perspective, we often set up experiments, of course, that require us to follow a very specific set of steps and procedures. So we train all of our people on those specific steps and procedures, and we drill them on them ad nauseum until they are qualified. But of course, mistakes happen. People make mistakes. In our experience, there is no amount of training that can completely prevent 100% of mistakes. It is important for us to realize that some of our workflows need to recognize the presence of errors and understand that errors will be there and correct those errors. I think one of the most dangerous issues about captioning is not missing captioning, but instead captioning that does not match the content of the program. Captioning that's off the point, if you will. In this room, I have been in a meeting with the FCC, I think it was December 17th, I want to say. We had a meeting about ENT. And we had recognized that the range of video clips, we had 8 clips total, and one of those clips was talking about the weather, of course. And so if you looked at the captioning seemed pretty good. But then when we double checked with an automated speech recognition app that I ran, and I looked at that automated speech recognition app, it was completely different from the captioning. And to a person who could not hear any of the spoken word in the program, the captions looked fine. They were deceptively good, but they were different from what was being spoken. I understand how that happens, right? I mean, the weather changes rapidly throughout the course of a day. I like to joke about Washington, D.C., and that, bring your umbrella all summer because there's no way you can know when a storm is just going to open up the heavens and dump all over. So I understand that it's fast moving, and that's the type of situation that you have to deal with. But there's also can potentially impact human lives, health, and safety if you're getting the wrong information. Could be a huge issue. So when you do talk about you have people who are monitoring captioning, and you're going to select, as you say, a couple programs to take a look for quality. I hope that they are also catching the mistakes and evaluating and reviewing them for later. I understand that you're going to get that for those programs you review, but what about those programs you aren't reviewing? And if we're then going to say that people can't do that job, another way that we could help to improve the monitoring situation, at least to the point where if the captioning and the speech are just drastically different, you want to be able to capture that. You can use ASR software as I described. And I described a human who was simply sitting, looking at the captioning and looking at the ASR that's being generated and recognizing that they were different enough. So I was able to do that work as a deaf person. I could recognize that that text was significantly different enough from the captioning that I could flag that. And how can we implement systems that are going to catch more mistakes and catch more mistakes more quickly?
Okay, thank you, Christian. Now, this next question, I think has been mostly covered, but I'll ask in case anybody has something to add. What steps are taken to ensure that ENT scripts adhere to the greatest extent possible to the 4 standards of captioning quality: accuracy, including speaker identification, synchronicity, program completeness and appropriate placement. And go ahead, Lance.
Yeah, we've touched on a little bit of this. I would say the accuracy, at least in my shop, is something that I've asked the actual teleprompter operator to do, and that's as it's happening. So that is a great way to have somebody who is, probably has a monotonous job through, let's talk about 6 hours of a newscast in the morning. Running teleprompter can get a little long. This person is now also tasked with, making sure that we're close. We're close to the scripts in both content and placement. I should say in synchronicity and the completeness. So I think there's a lot to be said there. As far as looking at these shows in hindsight, going back and doing these quality control checks, much like Brett, we would pick 2 or 3 half-hour segments per day. And I mean, our station does 6 hours of news in the morning and another hour at noon and another 3 hours in the afternoon, so it's a lot, but we spread it out. So kind of tasking more than one person to assist me as the coordinator to look at these things and to make sure that they are that we're really giving a good effort to making sure we're hitting these 4 marks. I find it interesting on the placement, as far as the placement of the actual closed captioning. My station, our station group that shares a common graphics package, and I'm sure just about everybody else in the business, the real estate on a television screen is getting pretty tight. There's crawls, there's lower third graphics, there's the content that, say, the weather department is putting up on their graphics computer. If there's severe weather happening, maybe not to the point where you have a tornado bearing down on a town, but say like a severe thunderstorm warning, there could be National Weather Service at the top. So there's a lot happening on many television stations right now when it comes to news. So placement, and I find it interesting that you also don't want to cover up your main focal point of your talent. So that's something that we also need to look at as the product changes. If we add an additional crawl because of weather, we need to be cognizant of where the closed captioning falls into this rather crowded house of the television set. But again, not to go on, but I do think that in addition to all the things that you can do on the front end to make sure that we're compliant and we're doing a good job with it, I think something else to speak about is handling a complaint. My background at the TV station for many years was an assignment editor. So I took a lot of phone calls from people about all sorts of things. If somebody calls and they need help programming their weather radio, you will probably try to help them out the best you can, even to the point of possibly visiting that person in person to help them. During the digital transition, people had trouble with their set-top boxes and having to rescan to get the digital channels to show up. I think closed captioning complaints or concerns should be handled the same way. And so I took great joy in being able to take someone who is concerned or quite possibly upset and to be able to handle it from a customer service standpoint, to find out exactly what their perception is, what the issue might be, and what we can do to fix that. It could be a setting that's incorrect on a television. It could be confusion over a secondary audio channel. It could be us. It's rare that an encoder would unlatch and not work, but sure, it could happen. So I think that anybody who reaches out to the station with a concern about closed captioning should be handled immediately and as fully as possible. And I, as the ENT coordinator, I take those very seriously. And I'd like to come away at the end with a happy customer, if you will. Somebody who, you know, I can go back and look at, we've got software that records low-res versions of our newscast with the teleprompting or the closed captioning embedded. So if somebody has an immediate concern or a specific concern about a portion of the programming that wasn't, that the encoding or the closed captioning wasn't up to par for them, I'm able to go back and look and see, and then find out why it wasn't, and whether or not that was an employee who had issues with time management for that particular day and wasn't able to do a very good job with their verbatim soundbite scripting, or any number of things. But I think that it's internal, and it's also listening to the response from the community when they have concerns.
Okay, thank you. Brett, go ahead.
Yeah, I would agree with everything that Lance said, and I think we've covered some of this in terms of what steps we can take as a broadcast station to ensure adherence to these 4 requirements. Again, it really does come, especially when you're talking about script adherence, that really does come down to a human being making sure that they've scripted correctly, that they've, they're following the scripts in terms of the accuracy, in terms of the synchronicity. It really does come down to that teleprompter operator making sure that they're following along, that they're trying to stay with the spoken word. Program completeness, again, is just a completeness check, right, that we can make sure happens. Placement, actually, interestingly enough, appropriate placement is almost the one thing that you can use technology and automate quite a bit, right? The accuracy is very difficult, at least with today's technology. Placement is pretty easy for, a piece of technology to go in and kind of look at the screen and make sure that it's in the appropriate place. And it's actually at least practice at our stations where we will have multiple eyes on that feature of the closed captioning, just like we do for a presence check, right? So if you're checking presence, you can check placement pretty easily. And so placement, I would argue, you deal with a little bit differently, because you can do that and spot an error very quickly and take corrective action. But again, in terms of the script adherence, a lot of that really does come down to that, what I call that relentless pursuit of quality, and just making sure that the journalists, the reporters, the anchors are sticking to the principles that we try to hold them to.
Okay, thank you. Kelly?
So what they said, and but there are a couple of things. I'm going to drill down on just a little bit, and I think there are problems that perhaps have technical solutions, but I'm not sure what they are. But I think there's some things that we can certainly focus on. One of them is the pace of reading. So with you'll get a different sort of pace depending upon whether the talent is running that teleprompter themselves or whether there's a teleprompter operator. And just from the human nature, some people read faster, slower than others. So I think there's probably a little work that could be done in pacing and understand pacing. Because in fact, the pacing of what you see is done for the person reading the teleprompter, not for the viewer at home. If you get someone who talks very fast, it's difficult for the average person to keep up and read at the pace that someone is going. And we saw that in a little bit of that script with the field report of the North Carolina segment, where that talent's talking very quickly, and even in the pitch, they're talking very quickly. And for me, I found it difficult to read as it's going by. So I think we have to find a happy medium there. The other issue, and Susie brought this up in her opening remarks, and I think it's a continuing problem, it's a little larger than ENT, where this goes to completeness, where you lose the last phrase of captions and a cutaway to a commercial. And there are lots of reasons why that happens. It is extremely difficult to solve. I'd have to have offline conversation about why that happens. So I think we have to look kind of end to end from origination of those captions to consumer products as to how we might try to solve that. One possible solution could be a hybrid where the captions could be coming, if you have a connected TV or something, part of the captions could be coming from online, so they live somewhere else, so the receiver could say, oh, I lost captions, middle of this sentence, and go out and go fetch those captions. I'm not sure of a good solution, but those are some things, pardon me, allergies are killing me. Now, those are some things I think we have to, in terms of sort of quality, we have to continue to work on. I think we've seen a lot of improvement in quality overall in captions since the rules were adopted. Well, because they're rules, but just generally, and I think also in ENT, some of that, the quality metrics, I think we've seen, in my opinion, a real significant increase in some of the basic quality and some of the completeness of those captions. Positioning, again, still a challenge. Anyone who looks at TV, I think that's going to be a challenge in being able to get a font large enough that's easily readable, plus taking up screen real estate. So we're going to keep working on that. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Kelly. And Christian?
This is Christian speaking. First of all, we also notice, and Norm, who's sitting across from me here, told me that depending on how big or small the screen is, you may, as a consumer, want a different font size in order to be able to read the captions. That's another way that placement can be very unpredictable. And I wonder if that's a problem that can be solved with the studio, or is it with support from the actual television, the end user device? I mean, that's, I think, an open question from my perspective. Secondly, I was happy that Kelly mentioned pacing, because I 100% agree with that the variety of pacing can be very challenging if you've got a fast reader and the captions are coming lightning quick. And that's something that I want to emphasize with ENT as well, is that in ENT, sometimes I feel like my eyes are going to fall out of my head because the captions are coming so quick. So I think that, I don't know, how should I say, but the basic rule for how fast captioning should appear, stay on the screen, and then disappear is a speed at which they can be read. So I imagine there is some technological support that could correct for excessive speed of pacing in order to allow for individuals to read it, but there also is going to be a lot of individual variation. That's a tough problem to solve. That is certainly a challenging problem. Of those 4 quality criteria for captioning, placement, synchronicity, and completeness, I think, are relatively simple, kind of binary yes or no's, right? If you asked a group of people to judge whether they met those criteria, you could get a reasonable group of people, ideally, to agree on a yes or no answer as to whether it met one of those 3 criteria, right? And you might have some fringe cases where you've got people who would disagree about placement when you have to make some trade-offs. But then you get to accuracy, and I'm curious to learn more about how that process works. Do you train the people who are monitoring the caption quality for accuracy? And if so, what kind of criteria do they use to apply to determine whether something is sufficiently accurate or insufficiently accurate? I see there's a lot of potential room for improvement there, and I hope that the research that we're doing with some of the people who are in the room here is going to help to inform that area better, to make some improvements so that you don't have to rely only on the subjective experience and judgment of an individual, but instead you can have some quantifiable data that you could use to really determine what an appropriate level of accuracy is and what an appropriate level of accuracy means.
Okay. Thanks, Christian. We are getting near the end of the program, but I'll ask the last question. It's again a question that we've touched on some of, which is, are rules required that each station that can use ENT and chooses to do so appoints an ENT coordinator and provides training to all news staff on scripting for improved ENT? What types of training does your station and the ENT coordinator receive? Please share how such coordinators and staff continue to be trained. What is your understanding of what resources are available for ENT coordinators? And again, we'll start with Lance.
Well, the station group that owned my station prior to Gray was Raycom, and that was the station owner that was there in 2014 when we put this together. And it was, there was a good bit of training, there was a good bit of correspondence, and making sure that this wasn't going to be a sort of half-baked effort on the station's side. This was taken very seriously by that corporate entity and continues to do so with Gray, with continued training. And when I say training, it boils down to making sure that there's an ENT coordinator that knows the rules and that knows what it takes to be compliant on paper, but also having sort of the corporate culture that has that holds that to be a major concern and gives the resources needed to be able to bring the coordinator and then in turn the rest of the staff for a full understanding of what has to happen for a complete closed captioning an ENT product. I think that really the best way is to catch concerns as they happen, address them as they happen. In the news business, we always talk about how it'd be great if we could talk about what we did wrong and what we did right, but we're on to the next product all the time. But it's important to have a conversation with that reporter that didn't get their complete script in before air. I like the idea of it just doesn't go on if the script isn't there. That's a hard pill, especially if something's missing, like say the tosses to a live shot or maybe the sound bite. But calling folks' attention to it, making sure they realize or they understand how important this is. It's just as important as anything else we do. Everyone is our customers are important no matter how they're getting our content. And in addition, it's not exactly the same, but it is good from time to time to get a group of producers or a group of reporters together, maybe immediately following a morning meeting, and have them take a look at a newscast with the sound down and closed captioning on, and ask them, are you really able to understand what this story is about by reading the captions and by looking at the visuals, and does it go together, and do you see any ways that we can improve that? So again, just the frequency and keeping these concerns and our interest in compliance on the front burner, and not letting too much time go between if there is an issue or a mistake, and calling attention to it so we can improve as time goes on. Again, assets like what's going to be on the FCC website and other materials that somebody like myself can review and is very helpful to make, because I will leave this this form with some additional information that I can use in my training to the rest of the newsroom as to how the captioning is perceived, and some ways that maybe we're not paying as much attention to something specifically read rate. If it's being teleprompted for an anchor, it's pretty close to reality. But if it's something that's coming off of a taped, or rather a file being played back that's not live, there is some variance in the speed of captioning. So I find that very interesting, and something that I think that that I can take back and bring some additional, shed some light on that at my station.
Okay, thank you, Lance. Brett?
Yeah, so I will say one of the advantages, I think, to our company at least being so large is we actually probably can afford to spend a little more time on issues like training across our stations. And again, I think of this as kind of a quality management issue, so we're striving for consistency across all our stations. And so we have not just for enhanced ENT, but for all our news operations, we have a massive handbook that is proprietary to our company that everyone in the newsroom gets trained on, and there is a large section in that handbook that deals specifically with captioning and enhanced ENT. We clear, so every person in the newsroom goes through training. We do have coordinators at each site. I think most of those coordinators, frankly, in the 4 or 5 years that this has been in effect, haven't turned over. So we probably haven't had to do just practically a lot of retraining of appointing new ENT coordinators. But again, we've attempted to kind of create that training manual for this and other issues. And again, as I said, I think we've talked about in terms of the policies that we have for constant monitoring and feedback. We use that closed loop system to try to identify which staff members need reinforcement and need to be reminded of what they're shooting for. In terms of resources that are available, I'm gonna, this is in the business, this is known as a segue. Folks like Kelly at the NAB continue to be a really great resource for our industry to make sure that this continues to be a highly visible and in focus area for the entire industry.
Okay, thank you, Brett. That was a good segue to Kelly.
Thank you very much. I don't know that I have much to add. I mean, I can speak from an association standpoint. I mentioned this before. We have, mostly from a regulatory perspective, the rules and best practices for both ENT and caption quality that we make available. And like I said, we integrate that into events as it seems appropriate for the event. And as I said, I'm sort of personally aware that there are a number of other companies, what's represented here, that take captioning as a whole, but ENT specifically, quite seriously, and that the training is out there. But, again, we're trying to manage human behavior, and we can always try to do a little bit better. But we feel like there are materials in place to train folks. And I would just, let me throw this in the end, and some of you who've probably been around me have heard me say this before. I think it's really important that the local stations at local level hear from the hearing impaired community in that station. Almost every station, local station, has some sort of community board, interactive group that they come in and they meet periodically. Call the station, just call the public affairs part of the station and say, we would like to get somebody from our local association, or I'm just a citizen and I'm hearing impaired and I'd like to be a part. That one-to-one contact with the station will go a long way to letting the station know that there are issues and problems and how you can work on it. The commission's process is great and it's fine, but it takes time. And I've always encouraged everyone. I assume that most of the associations, just like us, have local state associations or local associations in communities. And I would really encourage the hearing impaired community to reach out to their individual station and don't be shy about, not just when there's a complaint, but just saying, we want to be there, we want to be involved, we want to work with you. So that's I'll get off my soapbox now.
Okay, thank you, Kelly. And Christian?
This is Christian speaking. Thank you. I'll add two last points. First of all, Brett, I know you mentioned some of the proprietary practices in your manual, and if I'm understanding you right, then you consider accessibility to be a competitive advantage. Would you agree with that?
No.
Well, I would love that. If accessibility were a competitive advantage, take me seriously. I would love it to see it being taken very seriously. And I know you have a lot of experience training and determining how you put that training together to make it successful. So I would love to see those benefits cross-company, some way to share that information on how to train people effectively and appropriately. I can understand and I appreciate wanting accessibility to be a competitive advantage because I'm a favor of it, but I also want to see the practices spread. My second point that I want to mention, Kelly had talked a little bit about the local stations and interacting with their community. And I certainly like the idea. I want to see something like that. But I think that you can't wait for the community to reach out to the station. I think that it will be important for the station to take the initiative to reach out in the community. I think that will help build a lot more goodwill with the stakeholders, because at this point, I'm sure people kind of feel frustrated, and there are people who can feel disenfranchised, and they just are overwhelmed and feel like it's this inscrutable mass, and so they're not even going to attempt. But if that first olive branch is extended from the station to the community, I think that you'll have a lot more success there, because I think consumers will respond to that. I also wanted to add from the research community, for example, a Gallaudet University doing research into captioning quality and captioning usability. I would love to hear from you and to have an open question here for you. What is something that the industry needs to hear about, right? That you may not know the answer to. What would be important for you, something that you don't know that you would want to know? Please bring that to my attention, Gallaudet's attention, because we have an opportunity right now as we're formulating our research questions, and I don't want to miss out on that opportunity.
Okay, well, Elliot, I want to thank the panel. This was a very interesting discussion. Thank you all for coming, being here and participating in the panel. And I think we're out of time, and I'm going to look to Deborah about, do we go 15 minutes from now? So do we come back at 10 after?
We've got till 3, Elliot. So our break is meant to be at 3.
Oh, we have till 3. Oh, well, then we do have an opportunity for one, for one or two questions. Do we have any questions from the audience? If not, I have one from that was sent in.
Elliot, I have a question.
Go ahead, Theo.
Thank you. This is Theo. First of all, thanks.
Yeah, Theo, please use the microphone.
I yelled at home. Sorry. Thanks for being here. Thanks for everything. I do have a question. Two big things are changing at the same time. One is the presentation of content. Back in 2014, we were talking about this as programming. Now the conversation is exclusively content, and this is original stuff. This is the good stuff. So you've got changes in how you're going to present the content, presumably. The model that's being used right now for news presentation probably is going to change. Okay. And then you've got technological opportunity. Okay. How are you envisioning that? It's not a collision. How are you envisioning that intersection? What's the timeline for what we're going to see, and what is the thing we're going to see? Because our rules have to make sense for what we're going to see, and I think we're real close to that. How do you address that?
Okay, does anybody want to field that one?
I'll take a first stab, and then I'll let them talk about how this impacts news operations.
Yeah.
There are so many things on the horizon, and some of you have been in this process with me for years. We keep saying, "Oh, it'll get better. Just wait." And I don't want to present it that way, but in the context of your question, one of the things we did, we look at next-gen television. We fundamentally changed what captions are. Right now, the way we look at it, captions are part of the video. Really, in fact, captions is its own content. The term we engineers use is essence. There are now three essences in content that we talk about, whereas there used to be two, audio, video. We talk about three, audio, video, and captions. So what does that mean? It means we can more individually control what happens to that caption. Certainly within a station, and I'm rushing a little bit, it lives that way in a caption. We have content, we have a file that represents a content. But once it goes out the door, they're all mixed together. It will be different. So that provides opportunities for things that we've been talking about for decades, like being able to provide you captioning in 13 different languages. Now, maybe as a broadcaster, I won't send that, but I send a hook in my program that allows your smart TV to go out and get it. Same thing with the online programming. I mean, there's so many opportunities out there that we need to take advantage of, and not just captioning, but just accessibility, all accessibility. So I think there's a lot coming. You will hear from my employer, whether I'm there or not, as things change. And we're going to look at these rules. In a few years, next gen rolls out, we'll look at the rules, and I'm sure you'll contact us, and we'll come back to you and say, we think this doesn't apply. We think we should look at it this way. So that's my Cliff Notes answer.
Yeah, go ahead, Brett.
I would just follow up, and it's a very broad question, and I can give you hopefully a broad answer of at least the way we think about this at Nexstar. The variety of distribution channels is significantly disrupting our industry when we think about sort of television, broadcasting. That has caused the audience to continue to fragment. And as I think of audience fragmentation, we think more and more about customization of the content that we are providing. So that, again, it starts in terms of the distribution channel can change because there are more options now. And it also applies to the piece of content I want to watch. I have, a zillion more choices today than I had even in 2014, right? Much less, 20 years ago, right? And then when you think about accessibility, then the way that I'm engaging with that content, whether it's the device, whether I'm engaging, again, I think in the opening remarks we talked about, you can watch TV in a bar, right? A sports program, and you're going to want to consume elements of that content different from if you were in your living room, right? Or if you're in your living room with your family, that might be different than if you're in your bedroom with headphones and someone asleep next to you in the bed. So at a very high level, I think the business drivers, so to speak, right, the demands from the audience are in harmony with the need for us to continue to make our content forms much more accessible. So again, that's a generic, broad answer to what I think is a very broad question. We don't have all the specifics, but I can assure you that the industry is thinking about these issues, and we're looking for more and more from a technology and standards standpoint especially, ways that we can enable this reach to a very fragmented audience with the content and the way that content is accessed and presented.
Yeah, I think, I know that everybody's talked about voice recognition software and when is it going to get to a level that it's as good or better than it is now, certainly. I think that's the next horizon for me. At NAB, we're seeing vendors that are getting very close to having software that can do voice recognition and turn that into script. But as Christian, we talked on the phone prior to this forum, had talked that the mistakes are still there, and that the software is not at a point now that it makes that it's going to be able to replace how we're doing it. But that's what we want as broadcasters. We want to get the product as good as it can get. We want to serve more folks. We imagine. I remember when we'd have somebody translate the newscast into Spanish on the SAP channel. Imagine being able to deliver multilingual closed captioning, like you were saying. That's something that would serve a larger audience, and I think that technology is on the way. And I know that that the curve, it's going to happen faster, but it just it's not there yet. But I think everybody, both the viewer, the consumer, and the industry, hopes that we get there sooner than later.
Okay. And we'll give Christian the last word.
Well, thank you for that honor. 2 points about voice recognition software. It's not only about replacing the human, but it's also about supporting people in their work to produce better quality captions. So if you're comparing a script for your teleprompter with your voice recognition software generated script, if the voice recognition software allows you to make the script more expediently, then that's something you'd want to take advantage of. So we can look at it that way too, as a tool to use. Use that tool to help improve your workflow. And secondly, I've got to go back to content. Kelly made a very interesting point about looking at captioning as the third type of content, video, audio, and then captioning being number 3. And I think there's an author, if you're talking about Zdenk, the author Zdenk, who wrote a book called Read Sound. And that talks a lot about the specifics of how to represent sound in text. How exactly does one do that, and how the medium affects the way you represent that information. It's really fascinating read and a lot of good information there. Along those same lines, I would say that personal adaptation is going to become very important. Customization, a way to use technology, presenting verbatim captions for people who are able to read quickly enough, and potentially condensed captioning for people who aren't able to read that enough, or for people who have English as a second language. Some more simplified content for people who may have that need. That's an incredible option of customization. You're not just representing information for people who are deaf or hard of hearing, but it's for the whole universe of consumers, which includes a variety of disabilities and abilities. So the third kind of content, I think right in line with audio and video, is its own medium and should be approached with all the care that you do the other two.
Absolutely.
Okay, well, thank you, everybody. It was a wonderful panel, great discussion, and we'll be back at 3:15 then, now they have the time right, for after the break for the next panel. Thank you.
Okay, hi, welcome back, everyone. So just a reminder that this event is being webcast and will be archived on our website's event page. All of the video, the materials will be there for later viewing. So please encourage your colleagues and coworkers to visit our event page. At their convenience, they can read all about this event. So our next panel is stakeholder collaboration on implementing enhanced ENT best practices. And I, Deborah Packin, will be the moderator for this panel. Just a quick reminder that you can send your questions through email. And that address is livequestions@fcc.gov. You are also, for the people in the room, welcome to make your comment or question at the microphone. So this panel will address how accessible content can be achieved through meaningful stakeholder engagement. And of course, accessibility in various contexts is not a one-way street. It requires the providers and content creators to listen to the stakeholders' concerns, and for the people receiving that information should have a structured format with which to provide their feedback. We have wonderful panelists representing consumer organizations as well as TV stations. We'll be highlighting how firsthand feedback from local TV communities are very important, and the significance of consumer education, as well as the challenges to both how you communicate with each other and the range of options and strategies that we can adapt for effective communication and for best practices. I understand that ENT is an in-depth topic. We're focusing on how to educate and communicate with each other, and that is our focus for this particular panel. Great. So I would like to recognize our panelists. First, we have Zainab Al-Kebsi from the National Association of the Deaf. She is a policy advisor. We have Dan Carpenter with the he's a regional engineering manager with the Sinclair Broadcast Group. Next, we have Lisa Hamlin, Director of Public Policy for the Hearing Loss Association of America. Next, we have Joshua Pila. He is General Counsel for Local Media at the Meredith Corporation. And last, but certainly not least, Claude Stout, Executive Director of Telecommunications for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing. So we have a few prepared questions, and then hopefully we will have some questions from our audience, so please feel free. So my first question, please, is actually about an introduction of yourself, your work, information on live programming and accessibility using enhanced ENT practices. We'll go ahead and start with Zainab. Thank you. And I would like to thank you for inviting me to participate on this panel. As you mentioned, I'm Zainab Al-Kebsi from the National Association of the Deaf. NAD is the oldest civil rights organization in the US, a nonprofit organization by and for deaf and hard of hearing people. Our mission is to promote and encourage the civil rights for the 48 million deaf and hard of hearing people here in the States. Part of that mission includes ensuring civil rights through a variety of ways and approaches. For example, as we address this topic today, we have for a long time expressed concerns about the use of ENT because it covers as we consider it covering elements such as ad-libbing and considering what the functional equivalent is of how we are perceiving and understanding the dialogue in this way. So I'm very pleased to be here as part of the panel. Dan?
Hi, I'm Dan Carpenter. I'm a regional engineering manager with the Sinclair Broadcast Group. I've been with the company for about 30 years, and I guess the reason why they have me here today is because I'm one of the guys with my feet on the street at TV stations every day. I make the stuff work in the first place. I figure out why it doesn't do what we want it to do when it doesn't, and I take the calls from the consumers when we have problems that we can't easily answer, like by any old person or the receptionist at the station. So I get pretty highly, deeply involved in closed caption troubleshooting.
Lisa?
I'm Lisa Hamlin. I'm the Director of Public Policy at Hearing Loss Association of America. Hearing Loss Association of America is an organization that is nationwide. We have chapters and state organizations throughout the country and members who belong to our organization. And our focus is on information, education, support, and advocacy for people with hearing loss. And my job is to look at the advocacy portion. And so right from the beginning, our interest in ENT has been that right from the beginning of captions, people with hearing loss have depended on captions to get equal access to television programming. And right from the start of when we started looking at enhanced ENT, along with others at this table, we were part of the process to try to ensure the best that we can get from ENT. So I thank you for inviting us to this panel, and I look forward to all the comments from everyone here.
Thanks, Josh.
Thank you. My name is Josh Pila. I'm the General Counsel for Meredith Corporation's Local Media Group. I start by saying that kind of like those hair loss for men commercials you saw in the 80s and 90s, not only am I the lawyer, but I'm also a user of closed captioning. I wear hearing aids. My two sons, 8 and 6, wear hearing aids. My sisters wear hearing aids. I've been using closed captioning since closed captioning was on television, and sort of that's what I grew up with, and I see how much more my children are afforded than I was at that time. So as part of that, I've taken it upon myself with the National Association of Broadcasters. I'm NAB's representative on the Disability Advisory Committee, and I've been very involved in disability accessibility policy from the communications sector. In addition, for Meredith, I'm the one who captioning complaints come to, whether that's captioning complaints at the local station level or captioning complaints that are forwarded from the commission. They come through me. I'm not the one who's actually fixing things, but I work closely with the engineers and the consumers to be sort of a liaison of someone who understands what's going on, both from the business side and from the consumer side. And so I'm very happy we're having this panel. I thank the FCC for putting it on and for inviting us, and I'm really looking forward to it.
Claude?
Zainab, would you rather I get up?
No, you're fine. You can
Okay.
stay where you are.
All right, great. Hi, everyone. Claude Stout. I'm the Executive Director with Telecommunications for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing. I've been with the organization for 22 years. TDI partners with other organizations and has filed a number of petitions, one in 2004 and another in 2011, asking for improvements to the quality of captioning. Whether it be live, pre-recorded, or local news, weather, sports shows, what have you. I do want to applaud the television industry for continuing to make slow strides in advancing the quality of captioning of video programming. I want to also thank the FCC for its role in establishing policies and rules over the years. It was just back in 2006 when 100% of video programming was expected to be captioned. And so now we find ourselves in 2019. I hope that we will not have to wait so long to be able to see local news, weather, and sports programming be just as accessible with captioning and quality equal to that of all other video programming. When I was a little boy, I did not have the privilege of access to captions. I depended instead on my comic books, so being unable to watch my cartoons on TV, I read my comic books. And those were my captions. So today I see that kids like my age when I was young, watching their comic book heroes on TV. So I'm very thankful to have that opportunity provided to today's generation. I look forward to talking more with everyone, and thank you to the FCC for hosting the workshop.
Great, thank you so much. So our next question, what methods of communication between consumers and TV stations have your organization found to be effective? Please explain why these methods are effective as opposed to other possible methods. Zainab, shall we start with you again? This is Zainab speaking. Just to clarify that question, I modified that question a bit. Okay. This is Zainab speaking. To be honest with you, consumers often feel that there is no effective method of communication. They're feeling lost and unacknowledged. Accessibility methods of communication like email, through video phone, these are important indeed, but these kinds of communication also need to come with a certain level of understanding, accommodation, and tangible results. Okay, great. Thank you so much. Dan, would you like to respond?
This is the consumer. This is, yeah, this skip me.
Okay. This is Lisa Hamlin.
Good questions for everyone. So I sort of combined two and three together. So, I believe, you can respond to how you feel that communication is effective in whichever question you want to
Okay,
field.
I thought you were just jumping to the consumer. Okay. I guess I could start by saying, 2013, 2014 were kind of different times for us. We used to have relationships with the deaf community that we don't have so much anymore. A lot of it's, I think, because the quality of captioning has gotten better. I know a lot of the stations that used to do ENT are doing live captioning now, and a lot of the people we used to talk to, we don't talk to anymore. Our company, we get phone calls, but we get most of our interaction is through website, and we respond to everybody that inquires about a problem on the website. And I know stations are asked to reply to them and then report back to me or report back to corporate on what they did. If they have troubles with anything, I get involved. As far as collaboration with organizations, I don't know that there is much of that we do anymore, like we used to. But now at least the incoming communications to us, I think we deal with pretty well.
Lisa?
Okay, so I'm going to go ahead. This is Lisa Hamlin again. I think a lot of the method of communication that has worked, we have found that consumers have talked to us about is having a direct number to call. And we really appreciated the fact that the FCC was looking at having a name attached to a number. I think what the issue is for our group, though, is that you have to be a savvy consumer to know it. We have found at some websites that, you found people coming to your website, some of them are great, and you can see accessibility right on the home page. You find that number and that name, and the people are golden. They know how to contact the station or the provider themselves. But some websites are not so hot. You have to go under several different layers before you find where it is you should be able to provide. And it may not just be complaints, it may be feedback. Gee, can we do this better? Or I actually really like this captioning. I remember one program that was so good that I sent in a compliment. Those are the kinds of ways we want that communication. So having that name on the website is hugely important. But the other piece is there needs to be responsiveness to that. And everybody who's talked today has talked about how responsive they are, and I really appreciate that. I'd like to see that across the board. One of our consumers also told me, and this was a few years ago, that they were a little local station, and they didn't want to just know about the hurricane or the snowstorm when it was an emergency. They needed that information in advance. And when it's an emergency, we know we're required to have captions, but before, they didn't have that information. So they started a dialogue directly with their station, and the station said, you know what, let's do this. Let's accommodate that person. And then, I think Christian was saying this earlier, it became a competitive edge. The other station said, maybe we should be doing that too. So that was one way that really worked. The other thing happened, this is again years ago, back during the digital TV transition. I think some people here remember that, 2008. Claude Stout and I went down to North Carolina to do a presentation because there was lots of money put into providing all kinds of information to all kinds of people. And we provided information for people who are deaf and hard of hearing at a town hall meeting. But it wasn't just consumers talking. It was this local station who were talking to their community. And it was one of the best meetings I've seen because the community felt like, oh, I can make my needs known to the people who I need to make it known to. Because television is a cool medium and it's far away. But if you could talk to the people who need to know, it makes a huge difference. And on the flip side, when I was talking to the people there who were part of that town hall meeting, they too said, this is great. And now I know that the captions are actually being read by people who really need it. It really felt concrete to the people. So those are a couple of methods that I think would help communicating. People who really respond, and like you have done, and really talk to people. If that happened across the board, I think that'd be great. And more ways to reach out, like a town hall meeting that invites people in. I mean, somebody mentioned that there are boards for some of the stations. I don't think people know that. You need to really, I think, as Christian said, reach out in ways that feel welcoming and inviting.
Thank you. So I view the question in two parts, one being the communication types and then the other being the collaboration. So I'm going to go in that order. In communication types, I would say I strongly encourage consumers to use that name, email address, and phone number that's on the station website. And I ask that consumer groups notify their members that that's available. Because a lot of times what happens is someone calls the main switchboard, or someone calls or sends an email to the news tip line. And, that will get to the person. At our stations, the main switchboard, they have a note that says if someone's calling about caption, direct them to this number. But that's one more step. And then if it goes to the general news mailbox, it's going to be, 800 press releases an hour, and it's stuck somewhere in there. And so, the FCC requires that you have that. It's on the FCC's website and on the station websites. It's very helpful for us when people use that. The other reason why it's very helpful for us when people use that is because I know at Meredith and in other companies that there's a name, but that email address actually goes to several people. In that way, there's someone who's responsible for it, but then there's other people helping that person. So when an email goes to our Phoenix television station's captioning email, it goes to essentially the chief engineer of that market. But I get a CC, and our corporate VP gets a CC, and it serves as sort of our ticketing process that we can watch and see the replies that are going to it. And if we start seeing something go sideways, I can raise my hand by email and say, hold on, let's do something different here. And I think that's been very valuable when consumers have interacted with that piece. On the collaboration, one of the things that, and it's in part the methods, people constantly talk to our reporters on social media. I have a hard time understanding why we don't see more captioning engagement on social media, because we're monitoring social media as part of what we do now, and I think that that would give us some more real-time feedback, that we have software that monitors social media, and we have people who monitor social media, that it's a little bit more real-time than email or phone call in a voicemail box could be. And I'm actually pretty surprised that we don't get more, because I do see what we get. And what we get is generally, during the 6 o'clock news, we'll get 20 people who are just commenting because they want to comment about random things. And that this seems to be a more important use of that. So I encourage you to bring that up with, and not every station is going to be focused on it, but a number of them are, and that's another way. And then the sort of last piece I want to make is, there's one word that you've heard, for 3 people so far, and that's the word people. Television stations are staffed by real people, and those people, every broadcaster I've met is doing it for a reason. It's not because, there's not high pay, there's not, 9 to 5 hours. The broadcasters are doing it because they feel a public interest obligation, whether it's a journalistic one, an engineering one. And so when you can connect people to people, I've found that that's been much more successful. I personally have flown to some of our markets and met with people in our markets who are having concerns, whether they be individuals or groups, and sat and talked with them. But in order to do that, I know Christian said that stations should reach out, and I appreciate that, and that stations do have the ability to reach out to their viewers. On the other hand, if you're in Atlanta, Georgia, and you have 6 million viewers, that's a really small piece to reach out to. If you get that inbound, then it's a lot easier. So, for example, in Atlanta, where I live, we own the CBS affiliate, and I sit on the Georgia Center for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing board, and I encourage the executive director, hey, you're doing this thing, email the generic station email box and tell them you're doing it, and ask them if they want to cover it. And you know what they did? They did, and they created that relationship of 2 people. And it was a little dicey for a little bit, as many people in this room, finding interpreters, finding the appropriate location was a little dicey, but it was a learning experience for both the station and the organization that has really helped. So just in all of this, I just encourage everyone to remember, it's people, it's human beings that we're talking about. It's not, like we said, it's not just a wall on the screen. It's actual human beings that are behind the television station, and getting that interaction, I think, would be positive for everyone involved.
Thank you, Claude.
This is Claude. Yeah, there's 2 things I'd like to mention. The questions about the challenges that consumers have faced, and there are 2 things that I wanted to bring up. The first, we want to see local TV stations do more outreach and more education with the community, not just the deaf and hard of hearing community, but the hearing community, because a lot of those people are using captions in bars, restaurants, public places. There are people for whom English is a second language, or at least spoken English is a second language, but we're more comfortable reading. We also, the FCC has a wonderful small business compliance guide that was generated right after they released the R&O in February 2014. 2014, I think just later that summer. That was very helpful because it advises the local TV stations on what they can do in situations of limited resources. But you can do outreach, you can do education with minimal monetary costs, right, in your viewing market. So I would greatly encourage you to look into engaging and partnering. And I'll be happy to share some different ways you can do outreach and education later on today's panel. Second, I do want to thank and tip my hat to the first panel, but also clarify the perceptions of automated speech recognition, seeing the kind of recognition that it's not quite there yet. It's funny that Josh, you mentioned last year, but we did have deaf people who spoke up loudly on social media who were furious that there were some television programs and local news and weather and sports programs that were starting to use automated speech recognition generated captions, and there was a great hue and cry about that. I want us to take a moment to recognize that deaf people recognize when they see bad captions. They know when they're not getting the right information. And it is certainly enviable the day that we will get captions through automated speech recognition. It's something to aspire to, but we're not there yet. So I would just encourage us to keep looking at what the research results are and see once and whether the error rate is going to get to an acceptable level. And I would hope, certainly, we're not talking about more than 5%. Hopefully, we're like 95 or 98% accuracy. But the reason that the consumer groups are so anxious about that is because if there's emergency information that's being distributed, the importance of the accuracy of that information goes through the roof, right? Where a hurricane is about to hit. If you're in the southeast part of town and the hurricane's going in the northeast part of town, you want to know that don't head up northeast. You want to go out the southeast corner of town. And that's going to depend a lot on the accuracy of the captions. I do want to make another point. Don't use ASR to capture the spoken word only. I mean, don't forget that deaf people and other groups, deaf and hard of hearing people, some people can hear when they are getting captions as well. So we don't only need access to the language on the screen, but what is going on the screen. Right? So sound effects, sounds in the background, relevant information that's being presented in an auditory format that my hearing friends, my hearing family members are going to get, I want to be able to get as well so that I'm having the same experience. So please make sure that as you're proceeding down the path of ASR research and development, that we don't miss out on what we already enjoy now with support from human-generated captions.
Thank you, Claude. So remember, we are focusing on the communications between stakeholders and industry, but I really appreciate your remarks. So as we move on to our next question, which is specifically about what outreach efforts are used by the station or your own organizations that have been effective and why. And so just to mix it up, I'm actually going to start with Claude. Do I have his attention? Claude, we're starting with you.
Okay. It's helpful, as has already been said, that the FCC has had each local television station identify its organizer by name, email address, phone number on their website. That's certainly helpful. The ENT coordinator. We just had the first question. Where are we at, Deborah? We're on number 3. Where are we?
Yep. We're talking about outreach specifically. Sorry.
I can go while you go.
Okay. I would probably say in general, I think it's non-existent coming from TV stations across the country, but I do think that there is a responsibility to ensure that we're getting outreach education top to bottom, but also from bottom to top, right? Consumer groups have to be involved, local television stations have to be involved, but also the trade groups who represent those local stations like NAB and NCTA also have to be involved at the table.
Okay, Josh, you want to go ahead?
This is Josh. A couple of good examples of ways that outreach can be fostered. One is most television stations now have some sort of a community arm, whether it's related to United Way or a particular telethon or some larger community organization. And what I've noted is that many times individuals who are deaf or have hard of hearing are involved in some way in those organizations. And it's through those organizations that they get the opportunity to interact directly with television stations. And so, particularly the United Way, because of their sort of overarching focus, and I know, for example, one of our stations participates in the United Way Job Fair every year, and as part of that, they had a booth next to, I think it was actually a local HLAA chapter, and they got to talking. And again, getting back to sort of people, when you get the chance for interacting with people, those sort of larger scale local charitable organizations are good first steps for outreach. Another piece that I think is important for outreach is if you're doing something interesting, tell the station's news department. Now, don't expect that every press release you send, there's going to be a news story. You know, you have like a 0.0002% that your press release is going to lead to a news story. But in an era where news stations are trying to create compelling content, if you have a compelling story, share it. You know, one of the things that I saw is a local theater outside of the market that I live in was starting to offer ASL with theater productions. And they happened to be an advertiser on the television station. And they said to the television station, we want to tell the world that we're now offering ASL with the theater productions. They had an event, and with that event, the news department learned more about how that worked. And it was I think a real productive meeting of people. And then the last one is most local communities and certainly states now have emergency management committees. And on those committees are the emergency management personnel, the chief of police, the head of public safety, the fire department, usually also one or more television stations or the State Broadcast Association. And that's an opportunity for groups that represent deaf and hard of hearing individuals to be on those committees. Because I'll say, I mean, 70% of I get a lot of comments about how they want to turn the captioning off, or I get a lot of comments that they lost captioning on every channel because their MVPD messed up. But the most of my comments are, there was a press conference by so-and-so, and I want to hear it. And, you know, we had graphics, or we had something, but not the full word for word for that press conference while we were waiting for the live captioner to kick in. That's, I think, the biggest touch point that consumers have with television stations is when something's happening. So to get a little bit ahead of that, to involve yourself in those emergency organizations before the emergency happens. So 2 days before the hurricane, you're already there. I mean, I know in Mobile, Alabama, it's a really strong emergency management committee that whenever there's a hurricane, we get a notice that says, okay, if there's a press release, if there's a press conference, here is where the ASL interpreter will stand. Here's where your camera has to be to get it. Please call your closed captioner and make sure that they're ready for the hurricane. We get this like one pager, and that's because of the engagement of the community with that particular EMC. So those are the couple areas that I think would be helpful to get people together, people and people.
So I think those are good ideas. I think it's really would be good if it happened more broadly, because I have to agree with Claude. When I hear from my consumers, it's the consumers initiating contact. It's not the stations or the facilities saying, gee, let's reach out to the community and specifically talk about what we can do about caption or what it means to them or how we can make sure that they get the access they need. So that example I used earlier with a woman who wanted to talk to her station manager, and after establishing that personal relationship actually did really well, she initiated it. So I think the consumer organizations, I agree. I've been on emergency management committees, and I think they're a great way to be part of your community, and I think that's a good idea. But I think we need both. We need consumers to feel that they can contact their stations and feel part of their station, but it would be really good to see more station outreach to the community so that they feel comfortable talking together. So it could be both, I think.
Yeah, outreach-wise, I guess I have to agree with you 100% on my end, is, everything is incoming to us. There's not a whole lot of us going out to organizations to say, hey, how is everything working? But I will say, at the same time, if you work one place long enough, you meet people, or, the same people that called 3 times, you start calling them when you want to just have a status report on, you change captioning services and you want to see how things are going, or you change hardware and you want to know how things are working. There are markets where we have people that we can call, but they're individuals, they're not organizations. But yeah, like you said, though, most every communication is inbound to us.
Like my esteemed colleague said, and I agree. Right now, aggressive outreach by TV stations is not something that we are seeing. It's pretty much non-existent right now. But that could change. TV stations could start to be interested in outreach and not waiting for the consumers to reach out to them with their complaints. So it would not only be limited to a negative context. There could be an opportunity for positive interaction, positive opportunities for learning what is successful and what isn't, things that need to change, and a way to create goodwill and creating opportunities for interaction at the local level. So we want to work together to ensure that everything that's happening is a more equitable experience. So I absolutely agree with all the comments that have been said. Okay, thank you so much. So our next question, I know some of these are a bit related. So if you could share some of your consumer engagement success stories, including some of the details of what steps the consumers took to express their concerns, as far as how the stations were using ENT for live programming, and how the station specifically addressed those concerns. Zainab, would you like to start again? Sure. The NAD has a relationship with the National Broadcast Company, and they have been receptive to consumer feedback. We had a situation where a consumer reached out to us with concerns, and sometimes it's easier for them to reach out directly to us because, as we mentioned, they have reached out to stations and have not heard back. So sometimes they will reach out to us in order to try and get something to move forward. So we do not have any success stories on the local level, unfortunately, but we are hoping that that will change after this kind of dialogue and seeing that people are more willing to interact with their consumers. Dan?
Just a couple regarding ENT. I guess full disclosure, Sinclair is probably 80 or 90% live captioned. ENT is a very small part of our portfolio, but we do have stations that are ENT, and all of our stations use ENT in the morning, like between 4:30 and 6 a.m. Before the requirement. I can say as far as ENT goes, two come to my mind that I personally handled where we had, and I think Lance mentioned them earlier, or not the specific ones, but the same type of problem where we had anchors that were putting notes in the scripts, and they'd put dashes and little notes and things that they weren't profanity, but they weren't intended for broadcast, and they'd be in the script, and the call comes in. Nobody at the station really knows how that gets there, except for I guess I do. So we go talk to the news department and explain again to the sports guy or the anchor the importance of making the script be what you want to see on the prompter exactly and what we want to see closed captioned exactly. Yeah, as far as ENT quality goes, those are the only two examples I can think off the top of my head. Of course, there's so many others though I can think of where they were misunderstandings, or I know in one time in northern Michigan, the station was in touch with the guy, couldn't figure out what his problem was. They didn't have captioning on our news. They didn't have captioning on our news. We had captioning and we knew it. We knew all the neighbors in that area were good. I made a home visit and found out that he called the wrong station. But yeah, for me, that's I guess one thing I like about my job is I get to get involved in stuff and find out what's really going on. And it is good to meet these guys, and that's an example of somebody that actually it wasn't the person that wasn't able to see the captioning. It was his son who can hear, invited me over. We went through their equipment and we're like, hey, wait a minute, that's not our station, that's Channel 10. But now we have a relationship with that guy, and if there's something goes wrong with our station, I'll be sure to hear from him.
I think I cannot pinpoint a success story, and that's not because there hasn't been. I think for our consumers, they're not sure and cannot report back to me what they're seeing. Are they seeing live captions? Are they seeing ENT? Are they seeing, even if we're talking about small areas, I can't, places outside the top 25 markets, so we could say, well, probably it's ENT. I just heard a panel that says sometimes you use live captioning depending on the situation. So I can't tell you for sure that we've heard. I mean, maybe there has. I wouldn't be surprised if they called stations or had a complaint that was resolved regarding ENT, but we don't get the stories back because our consumers just don't know. They don't know they know if they're getting captions. Sometimes, I think part of the problem with captioning too, again, is you're asking people to complain about something they can't hear. So the quality is if something's missing, unless it was like our earlier captioning where a whole sentence was missing, and then even I knew something's going wrong there. But for a lot of us, it's one or two words, we can't tell. Do we know if it's ENT or not? You're asking consumers to be really savvy, and they may not know what it is that's going wrong. So they'll call you and say from the wrong station, or they'll call you with an equipment problem. It's not your captioning problem. So it's a multifaceted question, and I think it would, from my perspective, it would help if there were more education on the local level that said, this is what we're doing, folks, and this is what we're doing right, and can you give us more feedback and help us? And so and tell us when we're doing it right too. I know I don't only want to be told when I'm doing things wrong. I want to be told when things are going well. So if that kind of communication, I think, would be really helpful.
Yeah. This is Josh. I want to start with kind of that you're not seeing a ton of complaints, I think isn't in and of itself a success story. And I want to make sure that we don't let things on the margins implode the whole system. There are a lot of television stations in this country every day working really hard to provide really strong captioning, whether that be ENT or live. And to the extent there may be concerns on the margins, I'll say that if you ask me for a ENT-specific success story, I too have a hard time. I only have 3 stations that do ENT, and so the vast majority of my complaints, including one that came in yesterday, is my cable box is blocking all captionings, or I just retuned my antenna and now I can't get captioning anymore. It's much more of a sort of technical problems that come in, and I think that there is a good amount of outreach to communities, including, we have the FCC website information, we have general managers who are out in the community in a day-to-day basis, and I don't want people walking away from this panel thinking that TV stations are just sitting there twiddling in their thumbs, because they're not. They're out in their community every day working with charitable organizations, working with businesses, working with chambers of commerce, and that's a two-way street. And so, even if you just look at it, Meredith spends a lot of time, money, and resources for me to be here and for me to have these conversations. And I share them with other general counsels of other companies when we're talking about what there might be upcoming issues for, for example, we talked about, and we had that meeting in December, and I brought some of that information back to other general counsels and said, hey, here's what we heard from Lisa Hamlin, and this is what we need to look at. So I do think it's a two-way street, and I do think the success story is that if you look at Enhanced ENT, it is creating a platform where the vast majority of people are getting information that they want and need, and we need to sort of take it from that perspective. And turn it over to Claude from there.
Thank you, Josh. I'll just quickly summarize 4 different stakeholders here. Again, my hat's off to the FCC here with all the work that they do on their rulemakings, the small business compliance guides that they have. And I do want to recommend that they add outreach and education details in there. I do think that FCC staff and commissioners or bureau staff, when they travel throughout the country, that they should be checking in on some of these local stations and stakeholders to see how things are going when they're out in the field. I think that would be a good idea. Local TV stations, I would also encourage you, and I know it's been mentioned over and over, but to establish some of those meetings with your local community members, your local organizations. I want you to think of deaf and hard of hearing people and people who speak English as a second language and people who use captioning. I want you to put together news items on them. Right? I mean, they use your captioning. They're people in your community. And there could be those who, in communities that ENT is being used, are not even aware that captioning is provided in their local area and would use it if they did know. If your local TV station's own website could put together some kind of information about your offering for ENT captioning for local sports, weather, and news, I think that would be helpful as well. And you could also explain in potentially another article about your emergency weather broadcasts. If you have any problems, then folks could reach out to you, let you know about that. Speaking of trade groups who represent the TV and broadcast industry like NAB and CTA, I again want to thank those trade groups for asking the national consumer groups to meet with them. I want to say that we meet at least 2 or 3 times every year, and we've developed a good working relationship with them. Even though we may disagree about some issues, we have continued to come to some kind of consensus and meet in the middle to work on those types of issues, ENT among them. I would encourage NAB and NCTA at their conferences annually to have workshops that can support the local TVs, local TV stations rather, understanding their obligations and resources that are available to them, whether it be improving training or equipment or processes and business procedures. Last, the consumer groups, ironically, as organizations, we already have captioning action guides. And those are posted on our DHH CAN website. That information is also already in the TDI Blue Book, and the national consumer groups can continue to explore how we can produce separate or new content about ENT issues and challenges as well for our future publications, both paper and on our website. We can also continue to work with our local contacts and encourage them to either file complaints or reach out and work with your local TV stations first in the event that they can figure it out there, and if not, then to follow up with the FCC and pursue complaints there.
Great, thank you so much. I want to take the opportunity to see if we have any live questions eventually, but I do want to mention, as has been previously said, when consumers are reporting their concerns with Caption about their local news, are there ways to report it to the local news directly? How do they share their concerns with the station? What are the procedures? And what are the processes for dispute resolution? I suppose it's really more of a station, TV station question than consumer group.
Well, every one of our stations does have a published number and a website, and a link on the website for closed captioning concerns. And I can't say for everyone. I know in our company, that phone number goes to a responsible person that keeps a log of everything and makes sure that every phone call is acted upon. And every email goes to, in my region, goes to me and the local people at the TV station and someone at our corporate office whose sole job is making sure we follow up on closed captioning issues.
So we've talked about this, I think, sort of throughout as a theme in this panel, but sort of just some specific things to throw in there. You have local people who are real people in local communities that, if you reach out to them, are willing to help. We do internally at Meredith, and I'm sure at every other large broadcaster, we have quarterly training for our ENTs, ENT coordinators. We have, I actually have a module that I push out to new reporters in ENT markets that's like 5 minutes long, just giving them the basics so that they understand what they're walking into if they've never worked in an ENT market. NAB does have council memos, and NAB does bring it up with their corporate members on a regular basis. And so I do agree with Claude's comment too about when the FCC goes around to make that something that they do with the state broadcast associations. For example, we've noticed in Georgia that the last few FCC visits have ignored television. They've been focused on broadband and towers, which I understand that those are big sort of things. But if this is truly an issue, then that's an opportunity for the FCC to work with the state broadcast associations and bring in groups like HLA and other groups that have local chapters to work through that. And so I think that would be helpful.
Great, thank you. I just want to see if you have any questions from the audience. Please let us know, or if there's any through email. From Stacy Brody, we have a question via email. Excuse me, from Stacy Brady, a program coordinator at TAP Telephone in Missouri, for Missouri Assistive Technologies. So this is her question. For the panelists are speaking about advocacy for consumers. Why not reach out to your centers of independent living, commissions for deaf and hard of hearing, centers for assistive technology, and other like resources for accessibility for individuals who are not affiliated with disability-specific organizations. So we are all working with individuals of various disabilities and various capabilities. So including reaching out through listservs, conferences, and other forms of training. Does anyone have a response?
Stacy, thank you. You've made a great point. Yes, we absolutely can do better and do more work with the Centers for Independent Living and commissions for the deaf and hard of hearing across the country. You're right. Our organization, the National Consumer Organizations, have worked with the National Association for State Agencies for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing. We do work with that national level organization on a number of different topics. We've also worked a bit with the National Center for Independent Living on a few different filings. But you're absolutely right, Stacy. We should continue to explore some different ways to do outreach and education with those Centers for Independent Living, or CILs as I know they're called, and commissions for the deaf and hard of hearing and other disability interest groups. I think you're absolutely right. Thank you.
This is Josh. NAB certainly has relationships with many of these national organizations, including those on this panel. And I do know that, from time to time they've sort of cross attendance at conferences, attending the NAB conference or attending one of the conferences. I do think that's a great idea for some way that if you have a big collection of either on one side broadcasters or on the other individuals that are hard of hearing or deaf to bridge the gap. I know, for example, we did a presentation with the blind community over video description at the RTDNA conference in Baltimore, which is the Radio, Television, Digital News. I got it wrong. They changed their name. I always get it wrong. But we brought blind advocates to the journalists and to watch it and to see it, and I thought that was really interesting. And there's a lot of opportunities to do that the other way. So to the extent that there's opportunities in anyone's conferences at this table, either I personally or I'm sure we can find someone else either from that local market or from NAB would be happy to participate and open up that dialogue at a conference level.
Would anyone else like to respond? Okay. Are there any questions from in the room? Okay, I do have one more question here on my list. Consumer engagement can occur at every level, from working with an individual complaint to interacting and engaging with local community, or at the national level with a national consumer organization. What steps does your organization or entity, so what do you recommend that each stakeholder take to create an effective collaboration on a more grand scale? We can start with Zainab. Sure, this is Zainab speaking. I have two answers. One is not so grand, and the other is more grand. One is to address the point that Josh made earlier. Television stations often tell us, well, we never see complaints. It does not mean that there are not quality issues. People who are deaf and hard of hearing do not even know that there are captioning issues. If the caption it goes off point, as Christian mentioned earlier with his earlier panel, to follow the captions without sound, you're simply reading what's on the screen. I see the words, I see that the words are there, but they have no idea that the information they are getting does not actually match what is being heard. And even when the consumer realizes that there are quality issues, and sometimes it is quite obvious, they don't even bother to complain. They don't know where to send the complaint, or perhaps they don't feel the process, they don't feel the process is, it is a cumbersome process in order to file that complaint. They do not feel that their complaint will make a difference. They feel the process should be structured in such a way as they know exactly what to do and they can see the value of doing it. It's just not a random game of whack-a-mole when filing a complaint. Secondly, as I mentioned earlier, consumers are concerned about the quality, specifically of ENT. So the FCC and the people using ENT need to work with consumers in order to have full and equitable access to the local news. And one way we can do that is to support Dr. Vogler and support his specific research project that will help us to meet our goal of developing technology and metrics to have something quantifiable in order to find out that things are appropriately, the quality that we find appropriate for captions. And that way, no one would have to find a way to file a complaint to begin with. Thank you.
So this is Josh. On the first part, I do want to say I'm having a hard time with the concept of it being cumbersome to contact a television station, given the amount of contacts that television stations get every day from people of all shapes of walks of life. You know, in a day where you could tag a television station on Twitter or comment on their Facebook page or send an email to the email that's listed on the website. And I understand that it could be cumbersome to file a complaint and then have to go through the process of what a complaint takes because it is a government complaint. But you know, I struggle with if you can. I struggle with the concept of, well, we can't reach out to a television station. And I'm not sure how to address that, given that television stations are very open to public feedback in any form, and that in particular, in working with the FCC and the FCC's rules, they have particular contact modes open for this particular concern. You know, on the sort of quality metrics standpoint, we've had that debate sort of over and over and over in the DAC and in other forums. What I would encourage is that we focus on the things that we can do together that are more collaborative, in things where you're getting people together rather than trying to divide people with, well, you're not doing this well, you're not doing this well, is different from you're horrible or, you know, this doesn't work. And so it is a common, bringing people together, I think is one of the things that I really wanted to focus on this panel. And that's a two-way street. And I appreciate some of the comments that Lisa's made and others that it is a two-way street. And I just do think that it's a two-way street. It has to go both ways. And NAB and broadcasters are committed to that two-way street, and look forward to working with those on this panel and others as we move forward.
I guess I can probably comment a little similarly, but then I want to go maybe off track here a little bit as far as problems go. You know, like in our company, in every control room that has news going on, there's a closed captioning monitor displaying the captioning, and there's someone who's assigned to watch it. Whether it's a small market station and it's a news producer and he doesn't do such a good job because he's doing other stuff, that may be the case. But in everywhere we can, we have somebody actually watching the captioning. If there's an issue with it, whether it's timing or covering something up, we have that put in the news show report, and that news show report goes to the news department. If it's an ENT issue, it gets dealt with. If it's a U.S. captioning issue or some other third-party provider, it gets dealt with. And we try hard to not have to wait for someone to tell us what's wrong with our station. And we kind of feel it's important for us to kind of have a good idea of that in the first place. But I do want to say, though, as far as people that call in, we rarely get quality related calls, and I have a feeling that maybe maybe the issue is that they want to call us and tell us what's wrong, and they're not familiar with what we're doing. So maybe that's the problem, is since they don't know how to communicate that to us, we don't hear it. And I kind of wonder if, I don't know how you tell the whole general public that this is how we do closed captioning at a TV station, but I wonder if it would be beneficial for some groups and everything if we were to go over, like, scenario A, scenario B, scenario C, how a TV station actually technically works, so that at least those people could feed back to us and say, hey, we think the captionings it was 5 seconds ahead when this guy was talking, and it was 10 seconds behind when this guy was talking, and we think that this is what the problem was. Maybe if we were able to show them what we do a little better, then it'd be easier to communicate.
I want to say a couple of things, too. First of all, I would, and I think everybody on this panel, the consumers all have conferences and meetings, and they would love to have your representatives there, local representatives or from the national, just to spread the word. I think that would be hugely helpful. I want to, when both of you are saying, gee, we always respond and we get all these probably both complaints and interesting ideas or not so interesting ideas from the people calling in. But I think for people with hearing loss, they think that if they don't see anything on your website that says anything about either accessibility or captioning, they think, it's not for me. I think people with hearing loss have to beat their heads against the same wall over and over again and get turned down and get the feeling that if I complain, the burden's on me, and I'd rather just kick back tonight than sit there and complain about something I didn't see. So when I looked over some websites, and granted I did not look over every website for every station in this country, but I found it difficult to find where, if somebody wanted to talk about captioning, where I could call. And I have personally called sometimes an 800 number that I did find, and they said, oh, well, you can't talk to me now about that. And the person answering the phone had no idea who to turn me over to. So I think there does need to be more. Website is the first place I think one of our folks would go. Social media is a great idea. I've never even thought of it until you brought it up today. And we can push that idea out if that actually works for you. That's the kind of cooperation we can have and we can do. But I do think it's a matter of, and I love what I've heard today about monitoring. I'm really happy to hear that you look at it, not just for that it's there or not there, but that you look at delay and you look at placement and you look at quality. But then that goes to what Christian was saying. Well, you look at quality, but what does that mean? Does one station say, well, if it has most of the words there, it's okay, or, we need standards, and I think that's really valuable so that we know what we mean when we're talking about quality. And I think the other thing that I would love to see, too, is when you have successes, when you say, gee, we've been seeing complaints on this issue, and now we've solved those problems, you can tell us on your websites and say, you know, the station say, look, we saw this problem, and I've seen this on different sites for different technical things. You know, gee, I have a question about this, and then somebody answers it. They say, well, you know, we've already solved that question for somebody, and this is how you solve it. So we can say, you know, we used to get a lot of complaints about not getting captioning at all. This is what you do. You call me, or you know, whatever it is, the answers. If you see trends, let us see it. Let us see the trends. Let us see the solutions. Or if you're beginning to get a lot of complaints about one thing, let us see so that we know, gee, you know, maybe it's a consumer. Maybe all our boxes or cable boxes are getting old and they're not making the right connection. You know, if that's an issue, that's somebody, and I say, oh, gee, I didn't think about that. It's a matter of, you know, stuff that we don't know, make it as public as possible, and we'll be happy about that. We don't want to file complaints. We do when we watch TV. If it's the news, I want to know the important information. I want to not have to worry about how I'm getting the information. And I think also the best thing in terms of making contact with real people who are really like, I can't believe you went to that guy's house. I think that's great. I think it's wonderful to know that people making connections will actually work. I think our folks would also love to feel like they're being heard.
Claude, did you want to add anything?
I think everybody made some good points. I think it is important that the local television stations remember that they're getting this money from advertisements, from companies who get money, and they get money from consumers who are deaf and hard of hearing, right? So it's toothpaste or it's bar soap. We're looking for our money's worth. You know, we pay our subscription fees every month. We want our money's worth with good quality captioning of local news. And we're looking forward to working more with the FCC, working more with the national trade groups and local TV stations.
Okay, we have 2 minutes left, so I think we're going to go ahead and wrap up and say thank you to our wonderful panelists for your thoughts. A big round of applause, please, for everyone involved today. And now, I would like to invite Theodore Marcus to come back up to share some closing remarks. Thank you.
That means we should.
Here are the key points that I want to observe. Turn on the mic. It's Friday, and it's 4:30. So I get it. I want to say a couple of things. First of all, thank you. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, persons who are attending physically. Thank you, persons who are attending online. Thank you to the persons who are a part of this presentation, to Robert, to the commission staff, to the interpreters, to everybody here who's made this conversation real and happen. Thank you very much to Deborah Patkin, who did all of this, I think is a fair way of putting it. So we're very, very thankful to her. Yeah, round of applause for Deborah, because this is fantastic. Okay, so imagine that you're at a gas station. You're about to put your credit card into the pump, and you get this opportunity before, you're looking at the price, $4.25 for unleaded, regular unleaded. You're looking at the price, and you're not happy about it. And before you put the card in, something reads on the screen from a person who's involved at the highest levels of the company saying, you know how much it costs us to get this out of the ground? And then another person jumps in and says, look, let me tell you what the difficulties are in putting this on a rail car or putting this on a big pipeline. And then the person at the gas station itself comes out and says, look, I have to pay people to change the price, okay? That's an upstream, midstream, and downstream production conversation. That's the conversation that we're in right now. This is a very important opportunity to meet at all levels of the value chain. Why? You heard someone talk to you today about content. Content is the stuff itself. In the 1930s, we pressed books onto vinyl, okay? And persons who were blind were able to get to read. okay? That was altruistic, it was social, it was important, but it wasn't a revenue generator. Okay. Fast forward all the way through the cassette making of books. Where we are today, $2.1 billion industry in 2016 of audiobooks. Everyone is consuming book content, right, through audio mechanisms. That was not how that industry got, no one would have seen that in the 1930s, and that's where it ended up being. What we're doing right now is we're looking at an evolving content, right? And accessibility, which was the beginning, the origin of that content, is now looking at something new that is breaking forward and is going to be driven by persons who are deaf or hard of hearing. This is an amazing opportunity that we're thankful that we have the opportunity to be a part of. We're thankful to be honest brokers in this conversation, to contribute to the dialogue. And yes, there are critical regulations that have to be complied with. And that's real, and that's going forward. But what we're thankful for is that everyone is coming to this conversation and sharing their concerns at the top level, where the content is being developed, in the middle, which is how we're going to deliver that content and the mechanisms and technologies that are used, and at the downstream level, where consumers actually have to be able to receive it and get all of the extracted value from it. So thank you very much. Please enjoy your weekends. And the question now is, what happens next?